Hey guys, tonight we step into a world where the thermometer drops so low that mercury freezes solid in its glass tube, where your breath crystallizes mid-exhale and falls tinkling to the ground like tiny shards of broken dreams. You're standing on an 1800s American homestead, and winter isn't coming. It's already here, wrapping its icy fingers around everything you love. The wind screams across open prairie like a wounded animal, and somewhere in the darkness, your livestock are dying one by one. You probably won't survive this, statistically speaking. The odds were genuinely terrible, and the people who did make it through these winters were either incredibly lucky, incredibly stubborn, or some desperate combination of both. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And now, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your location and local time in the comments. It always amazes me how this little community stretches across time zones, some of you just waking up, others settling in for the night like you're supposed to be. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive in America with hope packed tighter than your belongings. Maybe you've sailed from Ireland, fleeing famine. Perhaps you've trudged westward from the crowded eastern cities, chasing whispers of cheap land and fresh starts. The pamphlets promised you paradise, fertile soil, abundant game, opportunity dripping from every tree branch. What the pamphlets conveniently forgot to mention was the cold. Not the polite, manageable cold of a European winter, mind you, but something altogether more savage. Something that seems almost personally offended by your presence. The first settlers to push beyond the established colonies discovered rather quickly that American winters operated by different rules entirely. You see, much of Europe benefits from the Gulf Stream, that great oceanic conveyor belt of warmth that keeps places like England and France surprisingly temperate despite their northern latitudes. London sits at roughly the same latitude as Calgary, Canada, yet you'd never confuse their winters. Americans had no such oceanic friend. The continent stretched vast and unbroken, allowing Arctic air to pour southward with nothing to stop it. No mountain ranges running east to west, no warm ocean currents to soften the blow. You learn this lesson the hard way, as all lessons seem to be learned on the frontier. Your first autumn feels pleasant enough, even beautiful. The leaves turn spectacular shades of orange and red. The harvest comes in reasonably well, and you think to yourself that this farming life might actually work out. Then November arrives, and with it comes a cold that feels less like weather and more like a physical assault. The temperature doesn't just drop, it plummets. You wake one morning to find ice coating the inside of your cabin walls. Your water bucket has frozen solid overnight, and when you step outside to relieve yourself, you genuinely worry about frostbite in places you'd rather not discuss. Historians still argue whether early settlers truly understood what they were getting into, or whether the promotional materials of the era constituted something close to criminal fraud. The land speculators certainly knew. They'd seen the graves. Your clothing, you quickly realise, is laughably inadequate. You've brought wool, which helps, but not nearly enough of it. The locals, those who've survived a winter or two, wrap themselves in layers upon layers, looking less like farmers and more like ambulatory fabric piles. They stuff their boots with dried grass for insulation, a trick borrowed from indigenous peoples who'd been managing these winters for thousands of years. The quirky thing is, many settlers refuse to adopt Native American winter survival techniques out of sheer stubborn pride, choosing frostbite over what they considered cultural contamination. Pride, as it turns out, provides remarkably poor insulation. You stamp your feet constantly, trying to maintain circulation. Your fingers grow clumsy in their mittens, making every task 3 times harder and 10 times more dangerous. Chopping wood, and you chop an almost unbelievable amount of wood, becomes an exercise in controlled desperation. One study of frontier life estimated that a single family might burn between 15 and 20 cords of wood per winter. That's roughly a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 160 feet long. You spend your autumn chopping, your winter burning, and your brief moments of rest dreaming about warmth. The animals suffer alongside you, though they have even less say in the matter. Your chickens huddle together in their coop, their egg production dropping to nearly nothing as the hours of daylight shrink. The cow needs to be milked despite the cold, which means you need to expose your hands to air that feels like frozen needles. Farmers developed a grim kind of humour about it all. Jokes about fingers falling off, about finding frozen neighbours in spring, about the special relationship between a man and his woodpile. You laugh because crying takes too much energy, and tears freeze on your cheeks anyway. The nights stretch impossibly long. By December, darkness falls in late afternoon and doesn't release its grip until well past when you'd like to be starting your chores. You work by candlelight and firelight, straining your eyes, burning through precious tallow. Sleep becomes your only real escape. But even sleep offers limited comfort when your blankets crackle with frost, and your breath hangs visible above your face like a personal ghost. Children fare the worst, as children often do when adults make poor decisions about where to live. Their small bodies lose heat faster, their immune systems struggle against the constant chill, and respiratory infections spread through families like wildfire through dry brush. You watch your neighbours bury small coffins in frozen ground that fights back against every shovel strike, and you hold your own children a little tighter, a little longer, knowing that statistics care nothing for love. The isolation compounds everything. Your nearest neighbour lives miles away, and those miles become impassable when snow drifts higher than your horse's head. You can't fetch the doctor. Not that the doctor could do much anyway, but his presence might offer some comfort. You can't visit the general store for supplies you forgot to stock. You can't even walk to church on Sundays, leaving you to conduct your own lonely services in your tiny cabin, praying to a God who seems to have temporarily lost interest in this frozen corner of his creation. Spring feels less like a season and more like a resurrection. When the first thaw comes, you step outside and stand there, face turned toward the sun, tears streaming down your weathered cheeks. You've survived. Somehow, impossibly you've survived. But even as relief floods through you, a small voice in the back of your mind whispers the truth you're trying not to hear. Winter will come again. It always comes again. You look around at your homestead, at the depleted woodpile, the thin livestock, the children who seem older than their years, and you face a choice that thousands of frontier families faced every spring. Do you stay and try again, armed now with hard-won knowledge, or do you pack up your remaining possessions and retreat to somewhere, anywhere, less actively hostile to human existence? Most stayed. That's the remarkable thing, really. Despite everything, despite the frozen fingers and the buried children, and the nights that seemed to last forever, most families chose to remain on their land and take their chances with another winter. Stubbornness? Certainly. Hope? Perhaps. Lack of alternatives? Almost definitely. Whatever the reason, they dug in their heels and prepared to do battle with the cold all over again. And the cold, patient as always, simply waited. The old-timers speak of 1816 in hushed tones, their voices dropping low as if the year itself might hear and return for another visit. They call it the year without a summer, though that name doesn't quite capture the full horror of what happened. A more accurate title might be the year that agriculture forgot, or perhaps simply the year of hunger. You weren't alive for it, but you've heard the stories so many times they feel like memories. It began, as so many disasters do, on the other side of the world. Mount Tambora, a volcano in the Dutch East Indies, exploded with a force that modern scientists would later estimate at 4 times the power of Krakatoa. The eruption launched an almost incomprehensible amount of ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, where it spread across the globe like a grey shroud. You didn't know about volcanoes back then. Most people didn't. So when the sun turned strange colours and the weather went mad, explanations range from divine punishment to mass hallucination. The summer of 1816 arrived on the calendar but never quite showed up in practice. June brought snowfall to New England and Quebec. Frost killed crops in July. August saw ice forming on lakes and ponds that should have been warm enough for swimming. Farmers watched in disbelief as their corn withered, their wheat failed, and their carefully tended gardens turned black with cold damage. The growing season simply didn't happen. One quirky detail that survived in local records: birds fell frozen from the sky in Vermont, landing like small feathered stones on the heads of bewildered farmers. You feel the ripples of that catastrophic year decades later, even though you weren't born until well after the sun returned to normal. The year without a summer changed America in ways both obvious and subtle. Thousands of families abandoned their farms in New England and pushed westward, seeking land that hadn't been cursed by whatever dark magic had stolen their growing season. This migration helped populate Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, places that would face their own brutal winters, but at least had longer growing seasons when summer deigned to appear. The psychological scars ran deep. Your parents, or perhaps your grandparents, never quite trusted summer after 1816. They planted earlier than necessary, harvested later than wise, and hoarded food with an almost religious fervour. Root cellars grew larger. Preservation techniques became more elaborate. The collective trauma of watching crops fail mid-season created a generation of farmers who expected the worst and planned accordingly. Historians still argue whether this inherited anxiety helped or hindered frontier survival. Certainly the extra preparation saved some families, but the constant fear took its own toll. You learn to read the sky the way your father learned from his father, looking for signs of volcanic interference that might signal another stolen summer. Unusually vivid sunsets raise alarm. Halos around the sun prompt worried discussion. Any deviation from normal weather patterns sends a whisper of panic through the farming community. 1816 taught everyone that nature could change the rules without warning, and that lesson embedded itself in the frontier psyche like a splinter too deep to remove. The livestock losses from that terrible year created breeding shortages that persisted for more than a decade. Cattle that starved or froze in 1816 and 17 couldn't produce calves in 1818. The knock-on effects cascaded through the agricultural economy, raising prices, reducing availability, and forcing families to make do with fewer animals than proper farming required. You inherit a world still recovering from a disaster that happened before you were born, still paying the price for a volcano that erupted on the other side of the planet. Food prices remained elevated throughout your childhood. The corn that didn't grow in 1816 couldn't be sold in 1817, which meant farmers couldn't buy supplies in 1818, which meant merchants couldn't stock goods in 1819. Economic historians trace threads of causation from Tambora's eruption through nearly 20 years of American financial instability. When your father complained about the cost of salt or the price of cloth, he was, in a very real sense, complaining about a volcanic eruption in Indonesia. The religious revivals that swept through America in the 1820s and 30s owed something to the year without a summer as well. When the natural world demonstrates so dramatically that it operates beyond human control or understanding, people tend to seek explanations in the supernatural. Preachers who promised divine meaning behind earthly suffering found eager audiences among farmers still haunted by memories of frozen crops. You attend revival meetings where the preacher invokes 1816 as evidence of God's power and humanity's helplessness, and you nod along with everyone else. Because what other explanation makes sense? The cold of that legendary year differed from ordinary winter cold in ways that survivors struggled to articulate. Ordinary winter you expected, planned for, understood as part of the natural cycle. The summer cold of 1816 felt wrong in a fundamental, almost metaphysical sense. It arrived when warmth should have reigned, persisted when it should have faded, and killed crops that should have been safe. This violation of natural order disturbed people more than any normal blizzard could. You plant your crops each spring with 1816 lurking in the back of your mind. What if it happens again? What if the sun goes dim, the summer never comes, and you're left with nothing but frozen fields and empty stomachs? You keep extra seeds stored away just in case. You maintain relationships with families in other regions, hoping that if disaster strikes your area, you might find refuge elsewhere. You prepare for catastrophe because you've inherited the certain knowledge that catastrophe is always possible. The year without a summer also accelerated technological innovation, though you don't think of it in those terms. Farmers desperate to extend growing seasons experimented with cold frames, hotbeds, and early greenhouse designs. Seed preservation techniques improved dramatically. The first serious efforts at weather prediction emerged from the chaos of 1816, as scientists tried to understand what had happened and how to anticipate future disruptions. You benefit from these innovations without knowing their origin, using tools and techniques developed in response to trauma. But knowledge has its limits, and technology in the 1800s remained primitive at best. You can't predict volcanic eruptions. You can't stop Arctic air from pouring across the plains. You can't prevent frost from forming on your crops or snow from burying your livestock. All you can do is prepare, endure, and hope. The year without a summer taught that lesson with brutal clarity, and you carry it with you into every winter that follows. The stories grow with each telling, of course. 1816 becomes 1815 and 17 in some versions, the disaster expanding to fill additional years. Snow in June becomes snow in May and July. Crop failures become total starvation. You've heard old-timers claim that half the population died, which isn't remotely true but feels true in some emotional sense. The exaggeration serves a purpose. It keeps the memory alive, keeps future generations vigilant, keeps the lesson fresh. Your grandfather, if he lived through it, carries the year without a summer in his bones. You see it in the way he checks the sky every morning, in the obsessive care he takes with food storage, in the slight tremor that enters his voice when June weather turns unexpectedly cold. He won't talk about that year directly. The memories are too painful. But he doesn't need to. His behaviour tells the story clearly enough, and so you inherit not just land and livestock, but fear. The frontier requires courage, but it also requires a healthy respect for how badly things can go wrong. 1816 provided that respect in abundance, a gift that keeps giving through generations of American farmers who never forget that summer itself can be stolen away. Your cabin squats against the landscape like a wooden apology, 4 walls and a roof representing humanity's rather feeble attempt to argue with winter. You built it yourself, most likely, or helped your father build it, or purchased it from someone who got tired of arguing and retreated to civilization. The logs fit together imperfectly. You're a farmer, not a carpenter, and through those imperfections seeps the cold that will try to kill you for the next several months. The construction process seemed straightforward enough during the optimistic warmth of summer. You felled trees, notched logs, stacked them into something resembling walls, and filled the gaps with whatever combination of mud, moss and prayer seemed most likely to keep out the elements. The roof went on last, usually wooden shingles if you had the time and resources, wooden planks or even sod if you didn't. You stood back, admired your work and thought to yourself that you'd created a perfectly adequate shelter. Winter would soon disabuse you of this notion with extreme prejudice. The first serious cold reveals every weakness in your construction. Gaps you didn't notice in October become highways for Arctic air in December. The chinking falls out in places, crumbled by frost and the natural settling of green logs that should have been seasoned longer. Your door doesn't quite close properly, leaving a draft at the bottom that seems specifically designed to freeze your feet while you sleep. The single window, if you're fortunate enough to have glass, which most frontier families weren't, frosts over so completely that you might as well have a wall there instead. You stuff rags into the gaps, hang blankets over the door, and burn wood at a rate that makes you nervous about your carefully stacked supply. The fireplace or stove provides the only significant heat source, creating a thermal geography inside your home that becomes intimately familiar. Within 3 feet of the fire, conditions approach tolerable. Beyond that radius, temperatures drop with each step until the far corners of your cabin hover somewhere between meat locker and actual outdoors. You arrange your life around this reality, pulling furniture close to the flames, sleeping in shifts to keep the fire fed, accepting that comfort extends only so far. Historians still argue whether settlers should have adopted indigenous architectural techniques more readily. Native peoples in cold regions had developed housing solutions over thousands of years, from the remarkably efficient igloos of the far north to the insulated earthen lodges of the plains. These structures worked with the environment rather than fighting against it, using snow's insulating properties and the Earth's steady temperature to create surprisingly comfortable spaces. European-descended settlers, convinced of their own cultural superiority, largely ignored these solutions and continued building wooden boxes that fought losing battles against the cold. The sod house represents a partial exception, a grudging admission that maybe the land itself knew something about shelter, that imported building techniques didn't. You'll encounter sod houses if you push far enough west, and they have advantages: excellent insulation, abundant building materials, relatively quick construction. They also have disadvantages that become apparent the first time it rains and your roof starts dripping mud onto your dinner. Snakes and insects find sod houses as welcoming as humans do, which makes for unpleasant surprises. But at least the thick earthen walls hold heat better than your thin log barriers. One quirky detail about frontier cabin construction: many families built their homes far too small, not because they couldn't make them larger, but because larger homes required more fuel to heat. A 12 by 14 foot cabin feels impossibly cramped when you're sharing it with a spouse, several children, and possibly an elderly relative or two, but at least that crampedness concentrates body heat. You learn to view personal space as a summer luxury, something to be enjoyed during warm months and abandoned when survival takes precedence. Your bed, such as it is, consists of a wooden frame strung with rope and topped with a mattress stuffed with whatever you could find. Corn husks, straw, dried grass, feathers if you're lucky. In winter, you pile every blanket and quilt the family owns onto this bed, creating a fabric mountain that family members burrow into like hibernating animals. The children sleep closest to the wall, which should be the coldest spot but is also the safest from rolling into the fire during the night. Adults take the outside positions, forming a human barrier against the chill that seeps through inadequate walls. Getting out of bed requires genuine courage. You've been warm, relatively speaking, in your cocoon of blankets and body heat. The moment you throw back the covers, cold attacks exposed skin like something personal. You dress under the blankets when possible, pulling on layer after layer before exposing yourself to the ambient temperature. Your feet touch the floor and instantly protest. Even through socks, the cold wood sends shivers up your spine. You hop toward the fire, add fuel, and stand there shivering until circulation returns. The morning routine becomes a carefully choreographed dance of warmth preservation. You heat water for washing in a kettle by the fire, knowing that by the time you carry it across the room, it will already be cooling dangerously. You wash quickly, strategically, focusing on faces and hands, while leaving the rest of your body bundled against the cold. Full baths become seasonal luxuries. Nobody strips down in a cabin where their breath forms visible clouds. Children suffer most from these conditions, their smaller bodies losing heat faster, and their developing lungs more susceptible to respiratory infections. Pneumonia haunts frontier families like a malevolent ghost, claiming children who seemed healthy one day and dead 3 days later. You watch your little ones with constant anxiety, feeling their foreheads, listening to their breathing, dreading the cough that might signal the beginning of the end. The cabin that can't keep out the cold also can't keep out disease, and in winter, disease travels on every Arctic draft. Your livestock, if you're wise, shelter in structures even flimsier than your own home. The barn or stable, really just a larger version of your cabin, with similar construction flaws, at least concentrates animal body heat and blocks the worst wind. You visit your animals several times daily, checking that they haven't frozen, that their water hasn't iced over, that they have sufficient bedding to maintain body temperature through the long nights. The care takes time you don't really have, but the alternative is finding frozen corpses where your livelihood used to be. Some families brought their smaller livestock inside during the worst cold spells. Chickens roosting in the corner of your cabin, a calf warming itself by your fire. These arrangements violated every standard of hygiene and comfort, but kept both animals and humans alive. The smell was something you learned to ignore, or at least tolerate. One particularly grim farming saying from the era noted that a live pig in your parlour beat a dead pig in your barn, and the logic was unassailable if unpleasant. The psychological toll of this constant grinding cold proves almost as dangerous as the physical effects. You can't think clearly when you're always slightly hypothermic. You can't plan effectively when all your energy goes toward basic survival. Depression settles over frontier families like a second winter, dimming spirits that were already strained by isolation and hardship. The cabin that should represent safety and shelter starts to feel like a prison, trapping you in close quarters with people you love but can barely stand after months of forced intimacy. And always, through every crack and gap and poorly fitted joint, the cold keeps coming. The sounds of a frontier winter include many things: howling wind, crackling fire, children coughing, but perhaps the most heartbreaking is the silence that follows a morning visit to your livestock. You trudge through knee-deep snow to the barn, lantern swinging in your hand, breath streaming behind you like a visible prayer. You already know something is wrong. You can feel it in your bones, in the absolute stillness where there should be the noise of animals stirring. You push open the door, hold up your light and discover that winter has claimed another payment. Your cow lies on her side, frost already forming on her still open eyes. She was fine yesterday, or at least you thought she was fine. Maybe a little sluggish, a little off her feed, but you attributed that to the cold. Every animal gets sluggish in deep cold. Now she lies dead, frozen solid, representing not just a beloved creature but months of milk, years of calves, and the investment you can't afford to lose. You stand there in the doorway, lantern light flickering over the scene, and feel something break inside you that the cold will never touch. Livestock mortality during harsh winters reached staggering levels throughout the 19th century. In particularly brutal years, ranchers and farmers lost 50, 60, even 90% of their animals. Entire herds vanished overnight during blizzards, cattle drifting with the wind until they piled up against fence lines or fell into ravines, freezing where they fell. The spring thaw revealed horrors that haunted survivors for decades. Thousands of carcasses scattered across the prairie, a landscape of death that took years to fully clear. The mathematics of livestock loss work against you with cruel precision. One cow can produce around 3 to 4 calves over her lifetime, meaning that each adult cow that freezes represents not just one animal, but a potential lineage of animals you'll never have. Multiply that loss across a herd, and you begin to understand how single winters could destroy multi-generational farming operations. Families that arrived on the frontier with reasonable livestock wealth could find themselves virtually animal-less after one particularly savage season. You do everything you can to protect your investment. You build windbreaks from whatever materials present themselves: brush, lumber, even stacked snowdrifts carved into protective walls. You increase feed rations, knowing that animals burn more calories in cold weather and need additional fuel to maintain body temperature. You check on them constantly, sometimes making middle-of-the-night visits when the cold deepens dangerously. But your efforts often prove insufficient against an enemy that never sleeps and never weakens. Horses fare somewhat better than cattle in severe cold, their winter coats growing thick and their survival instincts sharper. But horses still need feed, still need water that hasn't frozen solid, still need shelter from the worst storms. You've heard stories of farmers burning their furniture to keep horses alive, reasoning that you can build new furniture, but can't build new horses. The horse represents transportation, farm power, and emergency escape rolled into one. Losing your horse might mean losing everything else as well. Pigs, despite their reputation for hardiness, prove surprisingly vulnerable to extreme cold. Their bodies have trouble regulating temperature, and they lack the insulating coat that protects horses and cattle. Farmers who raised pigs learned to bring them indoors during the worst weather, sharing cabin space with animals that had no business being house guests. The smell was atrocious, the hygiene implications terrible, but the alternative was frozen pork that benefited no one. Historians still argue whether the health risks of indoor livestock outweighed the economic benefits of keeping animals alive. Chickens present their own winter challenges. Their combs and wattles freeze easily, causing pain and reducing egg production even if the bird survives. You coat these vulnerable parts with petroleum jelly or lard, a primitive but somewhat effective protection against frostbite. Frozen eggs become common, the shells cracking as contents expand with ice. You collect eggs multiple times daily, trying to reach them before they freeze, adding another task to your already overwhelming winter workload. One quirky survival technique that developed in the harshest regions involved digging caves or trenches for livestock, using the Earth's insulating properties to maintain survivable temperatures. These animal dugouts looked strange. You'd see a field that appeared empty until cattle heads emerged from what seemed like solid ground. But they worked. The Earth maintains a relatively stable temperature just a few feet down, and a snow-covered dugout could stay warm enough for livestock survival, even when surface temperatures dropped to lethal levels. The emotional toll of livestock loss went beyond mere economics. These animals had names, personalities, histories with your family, the cow that your daughter learned to milk, the horse that carried you to town and back, the pig that your son raised from a runt. Their deaths felt personal, in ways that financial calculations couldn't capture. Children particularly struggled with livestock losses, their tender hearts unable to understand why the animals they loved had to die simply because the weather turned cruel. Burying frozen livestock in frozen ground proves nearly impossible. Most families simply left carcasses where they fell until spring, when softened earth finally allowed proper disposal. This meant spending winter surrounded by the frozen evidence of your losses, visual reminders that appeared every time you looked out your door. The psychological impact of living amid livestock corpses for months contributed to the depression and despair that claimed many frontier families almost as surely as the cold itself. Insurance for livestock didn't exist in any meaningful form during much of the 19th century. You bore your losses alone, with no institution to help absorb the financial shock. Neighbours might assist with immediate survival needs, but they had their own losses to manage, their own depleted herds and empty barns. The community support systems that helped settlers survive many hardships could only stretch so far when everyone suffered simultaneously. Some farmers responded to livestock losses by overstocking in good years, reasoning that if they started with more animals, they'd still have some left after winter took its toll. This strategy sometimes worked, but it also strained summer grazing resources and could leave farmers with more mouths to feed during winter than they could reasonably support. The calculation was grimly actuarial. How many animals should you start with so that enough survive to keep farming? Nobody liked thinking in those terms, but everybody did. The spring assessment became an annual ritual of dread. You'd count the survivors, calculate the losses, and decide whether farming remained viable for another year. Many families reached the conclusion that it didn't, that their livestock losses were too severe to recover from, that starting over somewhere else made more sense than continuing to fight a losing battle against winter. Those families packed up their remaining possessions, sold off surviving animals for whatever they could get, and joined the endless migration towards somewhere better. But somewhere better had its own winters, its own losses, its own frozen mornings and dead cattle. The frontier offered opportunities, but it extracted payment in livestock lives, and no amount of westward movement could escape that fundamental bargain. The storm arrives without the courtesy of adequate warning. One moment you're looking at grey skies, perhaps feeling a drop in temperature that makes you walk a bit faster toward shelter. The next moment, the world vanishes into a howling white chaos that reduces visibility to arm's length and drops the temperature so fast you feel it in your teeth. This is the Great Snow of 1836, though you won't know that name until later. Right now, you only know that you need to get inside immediately or you're going to die. The blizzard of December 1836 caught the eastern seaboard almost entirely off guard. Weather forecasting essentially didn't exist. Farmers relied on folk wisdom, atmospheric observations, and educated guesses that proved tragically wrong when the sky decided to empty itself of snow for days on end. You might have noticed the cows lying down, supposedly a sign of coming rain, but nobody's livestock predicted this. This was something else entirely, a storm system so vast and so violent that it rewrote the region's understanding of what winter could do. Snow begins falling and simply doesn't stop. It falls through the daylight hours, through the night, through the next morning, through the following evening. You lose track of time in the relentless white assault, measuring days not by sun position but by the growing height of drifts against your walls. 2 feet, 4 feet, 6 feet, the snow piles higher than any living memory can recall, burying fences, filling roads, turning the familiar landscape into an alien wilderness where navigation becomes impossible. Your cabin disappears into the drift. That's not a metaphor. The snow literally buries your home, covering first the walls, then the windows, and eventually threatening to collapse the roof under accumulated weight. You grab whatever implements seem useful, and begin digging frantically, clearing snow away from your entrance while more falls to replace what you've removed. It feels like bailing out a sinking ship with a teacup, but you keep doing it because the alternative is suffocation inside your own home. Livestock caught outside during the storm's onset simply vanished. Farmers who'd let their cattle out that morning found empty pastures when they finally could open their doors days later. The animals had drifted with the wind, walking blindly until they dropped, then being buried where they fell. Searching for them proved both dangerous and largely futile. How do you find a snow-covered cow in a landscape that's entirely snow-covered? The spring melt would reveal carcasses scattered across miles of countryside. The human death toll mounted more slowly but no less surely. Travellers caught between destinations froze in their conveyances, their bodies not discovered until roads could be cleared. Farmers who attempted to reach their livestock died within sight of their barns, disoriented by the whiteout conditions and unable to find their way back to shelter. One particularly grim story from Connecticut described a man found frozen standing up, still gripping the rope he'd tied between house and barn. The rope had broken, leaving him stranded 10 feet from safety. Historians still argue whether the Great Snow represented a single massive storm system or a series of storms that merged into one remembered event. Contemporary accounts vary in their specifics, as accounts from traumatized survivors often do. What remains clear is the unprecedented scale. Some locations recorded over 3 feet of snow in a single 24-hour period, with total accumulations approaching 8 feet before the skies finally cleared. These numbers seem almost fictional, but multiple independent sources confirm them. One quirky detail from the Great Snow: the storm was so severe that it created its own internal lightning, a phenomenon called thundersnow that terrified witnesses who had never seen or heard of such a thing. Imagine standing in a blizzard, wind screaming, visibility nil, when suddenly a flash of lightning illuminates the chaos and thunder, shakes your frozen bones. Many survivors interpreted this as a divine sign, though they disagreed about what message God intended to send. The aftermath proved nearly as dangerous as the storm itself. Roads remained impassable for weeks in some areas, cutting off communities that were already struggling with depleted supplies. Roof collapses continued as accumulated snow compacted under its own weight, crushing structures that had survived the storm itself. The ground stayed frozen too hard for graves, meaning bodies had to be stored until spring allowed proper burial, a common practice, but one that became logistically challenging when the death toll spiked. Food supplies that seemed adequate before the storms suddenly seemed precarious after. Families had rationed carefully for a normal winter, not for an extended siege that prevented resupply well into the new year. Hunting became impossible in the deep snow, fishing through frozen lakes more difficult than usual, and any stored crops buried in outbuildings might as well have been on the moon. You stretch your rations thinner, cut back to 2 meals a day, then 1, then half, portions that leave you hungry all the time but alive. The economic impact rippled through the following year and beyond. Farmers who lost livestock couldn't work their fields as effectively. Merchants who lost inventory couldn't restock until roads cleared. The entire agricultural cycle shifted later, with planting delayed by lingering snow and the shortened growing season reducing yields. Recovery took years, and some families and communities never fully recovered at all. But something else emerged from the Great Snow, a grim determination that matched the storm's intensity. Survivors developed better preparation protocols, maintained larger food stores, built more resilient structures. They passed down stories of the Great Snow to their children and grandchildren, creating an oral tradition of disaster that informed future generations' winter preparations. You learned from 1836 not because you experienced it personally, but because everyone old enough to remember made certain you understood what could happen. The storm also accelerated debates about westward migration. If the eastern seaboard could produce such a catastrophic winter, perhaps the frontier couldn't be much worse. This logic was flawed. The frontier would prove capable of producing winters that made the Great Snow look gentle by comparison. But it motivated thousands to pack up and move, trading familiar hardship for unknown hardship that at least came with the promise of cheap land. When the snow finally melted, it revealed a changed landscape. Familiar landmarks had shifted, fences had been crushed, and the bodies of those who didn't survive lay where they'd fallen, preserved by the cold until the warm weather returned. Spring of 1837 arrived with the smell of death and the sound of grieving, a season of recovery that couldn't quite wash away the memories of what winter had done. And yet you plant your crops, rebuild your fences, and prepare for another year. What else can you do? The land remains, the seasons continue their cycle, and somewhere in the future another storm gathers strength. The root cellar smells of earth and desperation. You descend the crude stairs, lantern in hand, to survey the supplies that stand between your family and starvation. The inventory doesn't take long. It never takes long enough. Potatoes in one corner, showing concerning signs of sprouting despite the cold. Turnips in another, wrinkled and soft but still technically edible. A few cabbages that survived the frost. Dried beans in a barrel. Dried corn in another. Some salted pork hanging from a beam. Far less than you'd like. Far less than you'll need if winter stretches as long as winters sometimes do. Food preservation in the 19th century existed in a constant negotiation between necessity and chemistry that neither you nor anyone else fully understood. You preserved food because you had to, using methods passed down through generations, and you accepted losses as inevitable. Some years the salt pork stayed good all winter, other years it spoiled mysteriously, leaving you with a barrel of inedible meat and no explanation for what went wrong. The science of food safety lay decades in the future, and in its absence you relied on smell, taste, and prayer. Drying works for some foods and fails spectacularly for others. You slice apples thin and hang them near the fire, watching moisture leave the fruit until what remains might generously be called chewy leather. These dried apple rings, reconstituted in water during the lean months, will taste nothing like fresh apples, but will contain enough calories and vitamins to matter. You dry corn, beans, peppers, herbs, anything that responds to the process without turning to mush or rot. Smoking meat adds another preservation method to your arsenal. You build a small smokehouse or commandeer part of your chimney for the purpose, hanging pork and fish and whatever else presents itself in the fragrant smoke that somehow, through mechanisms nobody quite grasps, prevents spoilage. Smoked ham becomes a winter staple, its intense flavour a welcome change from the blandness of boiled turnips. But smoking requires wood you might rather burn for warmth, and it requires time and attention you might rather spend on other survival tasks. Salt proves both essential and expensive. You purchase it by the barrel when you can afford it, knowing that without salt, meat preservation becomes nearly impossible. The salting process involves packing meat in salt crystals, sometimes mixing in saltpeter and sugar to create various curing recipes that families guard jealously. Too little salt, and the meat spoils. Too much, and it becomes inedibly salty, a dried-out leather that even hunger can't quite make palatable. You learn the proper ratios through trial and error, mostly error, accepting ruined batches as tuition in the harsh school of frontier survival. Historians still argue whether frontier families understood the connection between preservation failures and food poisoning. Botulism, salmonella, and other bacterial threats remained invisible enemies, their existence unsuspected, their symptoms attributed to bad air, divine punishment, or simple misfortune. When a batch of preserved food made your family sick, you might blame the weather, the phase of the moon, or your own sinfulness rather than the microscopic organisms actually responsible. Root vegetables become the backbone of winter survival. Potatoes, turnips, parsnips, carrots, anything that grows underground and stores reasonably well in cold, dark conditions. Your root cellar, dug into the earth where temperatures stay relatively stable, keeps these vegetables from freezing solid while also preventing them from warming enough to sprout. The engineering is crude but effective, and families without adequate root cellars find their vegetable stores either frozen or rotting, often both in the same disappointing pile. One quirky preservation method that some families swore by involved burying vegetables directly in the ground under heavy layers of straw and soil. You'd dig a trench, fill it with potatoes or turnips, cover everything with a foot or more of straw, then heap dirt on top. In theory, the insulation prevented freezing while the earth's coldness prevented sprouting. In practice, results varied wildly, depending on soil conditions, water table and factors nobody could predict or control. The rationing begins immediately after harvest, not when supplies run low. You calculate how much food you have, estimate how long winter will last, and divide accordingly. This mathematical cruelty means eating less than you'd like even when stores are at their fullest, because eating your fill in November means starvation in March. Children learn young that asking for more food is pointless, that the portions are what they are because survival requires sacrifice. Malnutrition sets in despite your best efforts. Fresh fruits and vegetables, sources of vitamins that even you recognise as somehow important, disappear from the diet completely during winter months. You develop symptoms you don't have names for: bleeding gums, loose teeth, slow-healing wounds, crushing fatigue. Scurvy, the sailor's disease, appears on frontier farms far from any ocean, its connection to citrus deficiency not yet established in medical literature. You feel terrible and have no idea why. The psychological torture of constant hunger compounds the physical effects. You think about food constantly, dream about food, wake up still hungry and go to sleep the same way. Mealtimes become both salvation and disappointment. You look forward to them desperately, then face yet another bowl of thin soup or boiled grain that fills your stomach without satisfying your soul. Food stops being pleasure and becomes merely fuel, a grim necessity stripped of any joy. Hunting and trapping offer theoretical supplements to stored supplies, but winter conditions make both difficult. Game animals themselves are struggling, their populations stressed by the same cold that threatens you. What deer remain are thin, wary, and scarce. Rabbits tunnel under snow to reach frozen browse, making them hard to locate. You set traps and check them hopefully, but more often than not they remain empty, or contain animals so stringy and tough that the calories expended hunting them barely exceed the calories gained from eating them. Spring arrives not as a relief, but as a different kind of desperation. Your stores are exhausted, or nearly so, but the new crops won't produce for months. This hungry gap between last year's food running out and this year's food coming in claimed lives every year, killing people who'd survived the worst of winter only to starve within sight of planted fields. You forage for anything remotely edible: dandelion greens, wild onions, bark from certain trees, bridging the gap through stubbornness and desperation. The memory of hunger never quite fades, even in years of plenty. You hoard food automatically, eat faster than necessary as if someone might snatch your plate away, and feel genuine anxiety when supplies drop below certain levels. Frontier farming created a generation of people with complicated relationships to food, their eating habits shaped by trauma that plenty could never quite heal. The blackened toe stares back at you, an accusation wrapped in dying flesh. You didn't notice it getting this bad. The numbness that preceded the damage also masked its progression. Now, in the flickering firelight, you examine what used to be a functional part of your body and wonder what happens next. The skin has gone from white to grey to black, the tissue beneath hard and cold to the touch. This isn't going to heal. Even you, with your limited medical knowledge, understand that much. Frostbite earned its reputation through countless frontier casualties, a special kind of injury that seemed almost designed to torment survivors. The cold first numbs, providing false comfort as damage accumulates. By the time pain arrives, if pain arrives at all, the destruction is often already complete. Fingers, toes, ears, noses, any extremity with limited blood flow becomes a target. The frost bites, as the name suggests, and what it bites off rarely grows back. You try the remedies you've heard about. Rubbing the affected area with snow seems logical. Fight cold with cold, but actually worsens the damage. Warming the frozen tissue too quickly causes additional trauma, the ice crystals that have formed inside cells expanding and contracting in ways that shred delicate structures. The proper treatment, which involves slow, controlled warming in water, just above body temperature, exists somewhere in medical textbooks you've never seen and wouldn't understand if you had. Gangrene follows frostbite as surely as night follows day. The dead tissue becomes a breeding ground for bacteria, infection spreading from the frozen extremity toward healthy flesh with terrifying speed. You smell the rot before you see it, that distinctive sweet sick odour that signals cells dying faster than your body can remove them. The decision point arrives with nauseating clarity. Remove the dead part now, before the poison spreads, or watch the infection climb until it claims something you can't afford to lose. Kitchen table surgery becomes necessary when doctors are days away and waiting means death. Someone in your household, you, your spouse, a neighbour with steady hands, sterilises a knife over the fire, says a prayer that covers both the patient and the amateur surgeon, and begins cutting. No anaesthesia beyond whiskey, no antibiotics beyond hope, no medical training beyond necessity. You bite down on a leather strap as the blade finds the line between living and dead tissue, and you scream until you can't scream anymore. One quirky medical belief of the era held that frostbite victims should absolutely not be given alcohol, as it dilates blood vessels and can actually worsen cold injury. This directly contradicted the popular practice of using whiskey as both anaesthetic and supposed warming agent. Historians still argue whether frontier families who followed conventional wisdom about alcohol caused additional casualties, or whether the alcohol at least provided psychological comfort worth the physiological cost. The amputation sites heal slowly if they heal at all. Without proper surgical technique, wound closure remains crude. Without antibiotics, infection threatens constantly. Without understanding of sterile procedure, the tools used to remove one threat introduce others. Many frontier amputees survived the initial surgery, only to die days or weeks later from complications that a modern hospital would handle routinely. You watch your wound, change your bandages, and wonder each morning whether this will be the day the fever starts. Fingers lost to frostbite change every calculation of frontier life. Farming requires grip strength, dexterity, the ability to perform fine motor tasks that become impossible when digits disappear. You adapt, learning to compensate, developing new techniques that work around your disability. But everything takes longer now. Everything requires more effort, and some tasks simply can't be done anymore. The loss of 3 fingers might not sound catastrophic until you try to reload a rifle with your remaining digits, while a wolf approaches your chicken coop. Toes seem less essential until you realise how much walking your lifestyle requires. The balance issues, the limping gait, the inability to wear normal boots, all compound into a disability that affects every aspect of daily existence. Some frostbite victims simply stop leaving their cabins during winter, preferring confinement to the difficulty of navigating snow on damaged feet. This voluntary imprisonment carries its own psychological costs, but beats the alternative of further injury. Children proved especially vulnerable to frostbite. their developing extremities more susceptible to cold damage, and their judgment about exposure not yet fully formed. A child sent to fetch water might linger playing in the snow, not recognizing the danger until numbness gave way to serious injury. Parents faced impossible choices: keep children constantly supervised and get nothing done, or allow some independence and risk tragedy. Most chose compromise positions, and most lived with guilt about the outcomes. The frontier healer, part folk medicine practitioner, part herbalist, part prayer leader, represented your best option when injuries exceeded household capability. These individuals had no formal training, but possessed accumulated knowledge from years of treating similar injuries. They knew which poultices might draw infection, which herbs might reduce fever, which prayers the community found most comforting. Their success rate was poor by modern standards, but they provided what no one else could: someone who would try. Phantom pain haunted amputees long after their wounds closed. The missing fingers or toes continued sending signals to brains that hadn't received the memo about their absence. You'd wake in the night, convinced you felt your amputated toe throbbing, only to look down and see empty space where it used to be. This phenomenon remained completely mysterious to frontier medicine, interpreted variously as spiritual connection to the lost limb, nervous disorder, or simple madness. Recovery from serious frostbite often took entire winters, meaning the injury that occurred during one cold season might not fully resolve until the next. You'd spend months healing, months adapting, and then face another winter with compromised capacity to handle it. The cumulative effect wore down even strong families, each injury adding to the burden of previous injuries until the total weight became unbearable. Those who survived serious frostbite carried visible reminders for the rest of their lives. Missing fingers and ears marked survivors the way battle scars marked soldiers, announcing to everyone who looked that this person had fought winter, and, while winning in the sense of staying alive, had paid a significant price. These marks created a silent fellowship among frontier people, a shared understanding that required no words. The small grave yawns open in the frozen ground, its excavation a battle that took you the better part of 2 days. The earth fought back with every shovel strike, frostbound and unwilling to yield, as if protecting itself from one more burden. Your hands blistered despite the cold, then the blisters broke and bled, and still you kept digging because your child needed burying, and you were the one who had to do it. Infant mortality in frontier America existed at rates that would be considered a public health catastrophe by modern standards. Roughly 1 in 5 children died before reaching their first birthday, and those statistics worsened considerably during winter months. The cold itself killed some directly. Hypothermia in poorly insulated homes claimed babies whose small bodies couldn't generate sufficient heat. But more often, the cold killed indirectly, through pneumonia, through malnutrition, through the countless infections that prey on weakened immune systems. You remember the cough starting, nothing special at first, just the ordinary sounds of winter illness that every child seemed to develop. You gave the usual treatments: warm compresses, herbal teas, the honey that someone said helped soothe irritated throats. But the cough deepened, became wet and rattling, and the fever that accompanied it climbed despite everything you tried. 3 days later, you were standing over a body too small and too cold and trying to figure out what to do next. Winter deaths created particular logistical nightmares. The ground froze solid, sometimes to depths of 3 or 4 feet, making traditional burial physically impossible without extraordinary effort. Some families waited until spring, storing bodies in unheated outbuildings where the cold served as natural preservation. Others attempted immediate burial anyway, hacking through frozen earth with determination born of grief. Still others constructed above-ground cairns of rocks and logs, improvised tombs that would have to serve until warmer weather allowed proper interment. Historians still argue whether the high childhood mortality rates of the frontier represented a distinct crisis, or simply reflected broader patterns of 19th century death. Children everywhere died at appalling rates during this era, their immune systems unprotected by vaccines, their infections untreated by antibiotics, their dehydration from diarrheal diseases unrelieved by IV fluids. The frontier added cold-related factors to an already dangerous baseline, making bad odds even worse. The emotional toll on frontier mothers defies easy description. You might bear 8 or 10 children knowing that half of them wouldn't reach adulthood. Each pregnancy carried hope, but also a kind of defensive pessimism that protected against inevitable loss. Mothers gave children family names they'd already used, the second William, the third Mary, recycling designations from previous children who hadn't survived. This practice seems ghoulish to modern sensibilities, but made a grim kind of sense when names, like everything else, were too valuable to use only once. One quirky frontier tradition involved keeping locks of hair from deceased children, plaiting these into jewellery that mothers wore as perpetual memorials, a brooch woven from your dead daughter's auburn curls, a ring incorporating your dead son's darker strands. These morbid accessories kept lost children present in daily life. The practice continued even after daguerreotype photography made visual memorials possible, the hair seeming somehow more real, more connected to the child who had worn it. Fathers grieved differently, or at least showed their grief differently, constrained by expectations of stoicism that made emotional expression difficult. You dug the grave, built the coffin, carried the small body to its final rest, and did all of this with dry eyes because crying was for women and children, and you were neither. The grief went somewhere, into harder work, into longer silences, into the occasional outburst of rage that everyone pretended not to notice. It didn't go away, just went underground, buried like the child it mourned. Siblings processed death according to their developmental stages and personalities. Older children might assist with funeral preparations, their participation in adult rituals hastening their own transition to adulthood. Younger children might not fully understand what had happened, asking repeatedly when their brother or sister would wake up, would come back, would play with them again. Explaining death to a 4-year-old while you yourself are barely holding together ranks among the frontier's most impossible tasks. The community rallied when it could. Neighbours gathering for funerals despite the cold, bringing whatever food they could spare, sharing the grief that touched everyone eventually. A child's death reminded every parent of their own vulnerability, their own children's precarious hold on life. You comforted your grieving neighbour knowing that next year might bring the same tragedy to your own home, that the wheel of frontier mortality spun continuously and unpredictably. Religious faith provided comfort for some and torture for others. The belief that your child now rested with God, that their suffering had ended and eternal joy begun, helped ease grief for families who could embrace this narrative. But for others, the same theology raised unbearable questions. Why would a loving God take an innocent child? What sin had you committed to deserve this punishment? The ministers offered explanations that satisfied few, platitudes about divine mystery that felt like insults to genuine loss. The frequency of childhood death created a culture of memorial that might seem excessive to modern eyes. Entire cemeteries filled with small headstones, whole families represented only by children who died before adulthood. The frontier itself became a kind of graveyard, with burial sites marking every stage of westward expansion. Here lies another family's hope, another mother's heartbreak, another winter's victim. Spring revealed what snow had covered, small graves needing repair, markers knocked askew by frost heave, the accumulated evidence of winter's toll. You walked through the family plot each year, straightening stones, clearing debris, remembering names and faces that time was already starting to blur. The dead required tending just as the living did, another task added to the endless labour of frontier existence. And then another pregnancy, another birth, another child to love with full knowledge of how easily that love might end in loss. The courage required to keep having children despite the odds ranks among the most remarkable and least celebrated aspects of frontier life. You held each new baby knowing the statistics, knowing the dangers, choosing hope anyway because hope was all you had. The wagon train points west and you're going with it. Maybe the decisions made sense when you made them. Cheap land, new opportunity, escape from the cramped farms and crowded towns of the east. Maybe you simply had nothing left to lose after one too many failed crops, one too many harsh winters, one too many graves in the family plot. Whatever the reason, you've packed your remaining possessions onto a vehicle barely sturdy enough for the journey and committed yourself to a destination you've never seen. The Great Plains stretch before you like an ocean frozen in mid-wave, grass swells rolling to a horizon that never seems to get closer. You've heard descriptions of this landscape, read pamphlets promising paradise, but nothing prepared you for the sheer overwhelming emptiness of it all. No trees to break the wind, no hills to provide shelter, just grass and sky and wind. Endless wind. Wind that starts somewhere in the Arctic and arrives at your position having gathered speed and hostility across thousands of unobstructed miles. The promotional materials that lured settlers westward deserve special recognition for their creative relationship with truth. Railroads, desperate to sell land along their tracks, published pamphlets claiming that the Great Plains offered mild winters, reliable rainfall, and soil so fertile you could practically watch crops grow. Some even suggested that settlement itself would change the climate. The theory of rain follows the plough proposed that cultivating the land would somehow increase precipitation. Historians still argue whether these promoters believed their own propaganda or cynically marketed death traps to uninformed buyers. You settle your claim with optimism that will soon seem naive. The land looks promising enough in late spring, wildflowers blooming across the prairie, game animals abundant, no trees to clear before ploughing. You build your home from the materials at hand, which is to say, from dirt, since the treeless landscape offers nothing else. The sod house rises from the prairie floor, a dwelling that seems almost too primitive for civilized people, but represents your best option given the circumstances. The first summer passes pleasantly enough. Crops go in, rains come reasonably often, and you begin to believe those pamphlets might have contained some truth after all. You don't know, can't know, that you've arrived during an unusually wet period, that the rainfall patterns you're experiencing represent temporary conditions rather than normal baseline. The climate of the Great Plains operates on cycles too long for newcomers to recognise, and you've happened to arrive during an upswing that will reverse with devastating consequences. Autumn brings warnings you don't know how to read. The geese fly south earlier than expected, in formations so large they briefly darken the sky. The grass takes on a particular dry brown colour that old-timers would recognise as trouble. The wind shifts, carrying a different smell, a sharper edge. Your livestock grow restless, sensing something in the air that your human senses can't detect. You should be worried, but you don't know enough to be worried, and ignorance provides its own false comfort. One quirky survival mechanism that evolved among plains settlers involved reading animal behaviour as weather prediction. When cattle clustered together with their hindquarters to the wind, a storm was coming. When horses became skittish and refused to settle, conditions were about to change dramatically. This folk meteorology proved surprisingly accurate. Animals often detected pressure changes and electromagnetic shifts before humans noticed anything at all, but interpreting the signals correctly required experience that newcomers lacked. The first plains winter hits you like a physical assault. The temperature drops aren't like eastern winters, aren't like anything you've experienced. The thermometer, if you have one, shows numbers you didn't know were possible. -20, -30, -40, a temperature where Fahrenheit and Celsius converge in a kind of cosmic joke. Your breath freezes on your eyebrows, on your beard if you have one, on the scarf wrapped around your face. Exposed skin begins to damage within minutes. And then the wind. Oh, the wind. Eastern winters have wind, certainly, but not like this. The Great Plains wind seems personally vindictive, seeking out every gap in your clothing, every crack in your sod walls, every vulnerable inch of exposed flesh. Wind chill as a scientific concept won't be formalised until the 20th century, but you understand the principle intimately. The wind doesn't just feel cold, it steals heat from your body faster than you can replace it. Your sod house, which seemed so sturdy in summer, reveals winter weaknesses you hadn't anticipated. The thick earthen walls do insulate well, better than wooden cabins in some respects, but the roof, often just boards covered with more sod, tends to leak when snow melts, dripping cold mud onto everything below. The single window, if you have one, offers little light during the shortened days and lets in cold around poorly fitted frames. The interior stays dim, damp, and depressingly close. Fuel becomes an immediate crisis. You've brought some coal, perhaps purchased at ruinous prices from a distant supplier, but not nearly enough for a full winter. Wood barely exists on the treeless plains. A few cottonwoods along streams represent the entire local supply, and everyone needs them. You turn to alternative fuels that would have seemed unimaginable in your previous life. Dried buffalo chips burn surprisingly well, if you can find them. Dried cow manure serves the same purpose once your own cattle have been on the land long enough to produce it. Twisted hay provides quick heat that doesn't last. You become creative in ways that necessity demands and dignity protests. The isolation of your plains homestead exceeds anything you experienced in the East. Your nearest neighbour might be miles away, invisible across the flat landscape, unreachable when snow drifts 20 feet high between your properties. The roads that existed in summer, really just wagon tracks through the grass, disappear completely under accumulated snow. You could walk in any direction and find nothing but more prairie, more wind, more cold, more of the emptiness that seemed romantic in August and terrifying in February. You've made a terrible mistake. You know this now, huddled in your sod house, burning fuel you can't replace, eating supplies that won't last, watching the horizon for a storm that might kill you. But there's nothing to do about it. Nowhere to go, no way back to the life you left. The West has swallowed you whole, and winter is just beginning. The sod house settles around you like a living thing, its earthen walls breathing with the seasons in ways that wooden structures never would. In summer, grass still grows from the roof, a peculiar pastoral sight that makes your dwelling look like the landscape is slowly reclaiming it. In winter, that same organic construction becomes both blessing and curse. Insulation, excellent. Structural integrity, questionable. And the constant presence of the prairie itself, invading your living space in forms you'd rather not consider. Building a proper sod house requires technique that many settlers learned through expensive trial and error. The best sod comes from low-lying areas where grass roots form dense, interlocking networks. This prairie marble cuts into bricks that hold their shape and stack securely. Upland sod, less rooted and more crumbly, makes inferior building material that tends to collapse at inconvenient moments. You learn to identify good sod the way a carpenter learns to identify good lumber, and you pay dearly for your education in failed walls and collapsing roofs. The standard sod house construction involves stacking sod bricks in offset rows, just like masonry, with the grass side down to promote continued root growth and binding. Walls rise 2 to 3 feet thick, a mass of earth that provides remarkable insulation. Sod houses stay cool in summer and, in theory, warm in winter. The theory breaks down somewhat in practice, where windows, doors and roof joints create thermal weak points that the prairie wind finds with unerring accuracy. Roofing presents particular challenges. The ideal solution involves wooden beams spanning the walls, covered by boards, topped by a final layer of sod that blends the structure into the surrounding landscape. But wood requires either money or trees, and you likely have limited access to either. Cheaper alternatives, willow branches, woven grass, hopeful improvisation, create roofs that sag under snow weight, leak during thaws, and periodically collapse entirely, usually at the worst possible moment. One quirky structural feature of sod houses was their tendency to host resident wildlife. The walls themselves contained insects, mice, and occasionally snakes, all of which migrated inward during cold weather, seeking the warmth your fire provided. You might wake to find a snake sharing your bed, having emerged from the wall seeking heat. Mice scurried through wall passages at all hours, their scratching becoming either white noise you ignored or a maddening distraction that eroded your sanity, depending on your psychological resilience. The interior of a typical sod house measures perhaps 16 by 20 feet if you're ambitious, smaller if you're not. This space must accommodate sleeping, cooking, eating, socializing, and the 1,000 other activities of daily life. Privacy exists only in theory. Everyone knows everyone else's business because everyone lives in the same room, shares the same air, hears the same snores and sighs and arguments. Intimate moments require either extreme stealth or philosophical acceptance that the children probably aren't as asleep as they seem. Furniture arrives with you if you're lucky, gets built from whatever materials present themselves if you're not. Beds might be wooden frames brought across the prairie, or might be ropes suspended from posts, or might simply be blankets on the dirt floor in the corner least likely to get dripped on. Tables serve multiple purposes: eating surface, work space, occasional sick bed, perhaps even coffin platform when the need arises. Everything in a sod house does double or triple duty. Specialization is a luxury you can't afford. Heating the sod house involves the same challenges faced by any frontier dwelling, with some additional complications. The thick walls, while insulating, also absorb heat, meaning your fire must warm not just the air but also thousands of pounds of slowly warming earth. The first fire of the season feels futile. Most of your heat disappears into the walls before you feel any benefit. Only after days of continuous burning do the walls reach equilibrium and start contributing to rather than detracting from indoor temperature. The floor presents special problems. Dirt floors, standard in sod houses, turn to mud when wet and dust when dry, with a narrow comfortable zone between. During winter, frost can heave the floor itself, creating lumps and valleys that make furniture placement an ongoing negotiation with the earth. Some families laid boards over the worst spots, creating islands of stability in a sea of shifting ground. Others simply accepted the floor's moods as one more thing beyond their control. Historians still argue whether sod houses represented genuine adaptation to plains conditions, or a kind of infrastructural poverty that settlers endured only until better options became available. Indigenous peoples of the plains had developed different housing solutions, teepees that could be moved to follow game, semi-permanent earthen lodges that combined the advantages of portability and permanence. The sod house emerged as a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but kept people alive while they figured out what to do next. Your sod house protects you from the wind mostly, and from the worst cold somewhat, but it cannot protect you from the psychological weight of plains winter. The darkness settles in early and lifts late, leaving long hours with nothing but firelight and whatever conversation your family can sustain. The isolation that seemed like freedom in summer becomes confinement in winter, your sod walls transformed from shelter into prison. Cabin fever, or more accurately sod house fever, claims mental health even when physical health holds. The sounds of a sod house at night include the expected, fire crackling, wind howling, and the unexpected, walls settling, roof creaking, whatever lives in the walls going about its business. You learn to distinguish ordinary sounds from alarming ones, ordinary settling from structural failure, ordinary animal activity from the kind that suggests predator intrusion. This constant audio monitoring becomes automatic, a background process that never quite shuts off, leaving you perpetually alert even when exhausted. Spring reveals winter's toll on your dwelling. Walls have slumped, roof has sagged. The entire structure looks somehow defeated by its 6-month battle with the elements. Repairs consume the brief good weather, patching and reinforcing for next year's assault. You wonder sometimes whether the house is keeping the prairie out, or whether the prairie is simply biding its time, waiting for the moment when your defences finally fail and it can reclaim what you've temporarily borrowed. The sod house was never meant to be permanent, just a stepping stone to something better. But permanent or not, it stands between you and a prairie winter that makes no distinction between temporary and forever. The winter of 1856 into 57 arrives with warnings that everyone ignores or doesn't recognise. Autumn has been strange, unusually warm days alternating with sudden cold snaps, as if the weather itself can't decide what season to implement. Old-timers shake their heads at sky signs they don't like, but old-timers always shake their heads about something. Besides, you're too busy preparing for an ordinary winter to worry about an extraordinary one. The first major storm hits in early December, dumping snow across the upper Midwest with a ferocity that exceeds recent memory. You wake to drifts against your door that prevent it from opening, requiring excavation through a window before you can assess the damage outside. The livestock barn is buried to its roof in places, the animals inside already stressed from a storm that lasted 2 days straight. You dig paths to essential locations and hope this represents the winter's worst. It doesn't. The storms keep coming with a regularity that feels almost systematic, as if nature is following some malevolent schedule designed to maximize suffering. A few days of recovery, just enough to make progress on digging out, then another blizzard arrives to undo all your work. Snow accumulates in layers that will later provide a geological record of the season's events. Here, the storm of December 15th. There, the blizzard of Christmas Eve. Above that, the terrifying 3-day assault of early January. The Spirit Lake region of northwest Iowa becomes the winter's epicenter of suffering. Settlers there, recently arrived and poorly prepared, face conditions that veteran frontier families would find challenging. The Wapikute Band of Dakota, themselves stressed by white encroachment and reduced resources, see an opportunity that desperation makes attractive. The combination of harsh weather and human conflict creates the Spirit Lake Massacre, an event that will echo through regional history for generations. You hear about the massacre through the unreliable channels of frontier communication, whispered rumours, second-hand accounts, facts that grow or shrink depending on who's telling them. The initial stories claim dozens killed, then hundreds, then numbers so large they can't possibly be true. Historians still argue about the exact death toll and the precise sequence of events, their disagreements reflecting both the chaos of the moment and the political uses to which the story was subsequently put. But you don't need exact numbers to understand the terror. Families killed in their homes, cabins burned with occupants inside, survivors fleeing across frozen landscapes with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The winter itself becomes an accomplice to the violence, the cold finishing what human attackers started. Some victims freeze before their wounds can kill them. Others escape the immediate danger only to die of exposure in the following days. The military response arrives too late to prevent the massacre and struggles through conditions that defeat tactical planning. Soldiers march through snow that rises to their waists, their supply lines broken by drifts that bury entire wagon trains. The punitive expedition eventually achieves its objectives, but the process takes weeks that feel like months, the army fighting weather as much as any human enemy. One quirky detail from the Spirit Lake winter: survivors reported that the cold was so intense that discharged firearms didn't produce normal smoke. The powder burned, the bullets flew, but the usual cloud of white smoke simply didn't form. The atmospheric conditions were too extreme for normal combustion products. This might be exaggeration or might be accurate observation. The strangeness of that winter defied ordinary experience in ways that made everything seem possible. The psychological aftermath of Spirit Lake extended far beyond the immediate victims. Every settler in the region now faced not just weather threats, but human ones as well. The already difficult calculus of frontier survival complicated by the fear of attack. Some families abandoned their claims immediately, retreating eastward with whatever they could carry. Others stayed but slept with weapons at hand, their vigilance adding exhaustion to their already overtaxed systems. Minnesota Territory, adjacent to Iowa and experiencing the same brutal weather, saw its own cascade of suffering. Settlers who'd arrived during easier years found their assumptions shattered by conditions they hadn't anticipated. The promotional literature hadn't mentioned winters like this. The land speculators hadn't warned about temperatures that could kill livestock overnight. The optimistic immigrants from Norway and Sweden, supposedly accustomed to northern climates, discovered that Minnesota cold operated on a different scale entirely. Starvation became genuine concern rather than abstract possibility. The storms prevented resupply from reaching isolated communities, while simultaneously making travel to distant markets impossible. Whatever food you'd stored in autumn had to last until the weather allowed commerce to resume, whenever that might be. Rationing that seemed adequate in December proved inadequate by February, portions shrinking to sustenance levels that left everyone hungry and weakened. The death toll from the winter of 1856 to 57 remains impossible to precisely calculate. Direct deaths from cold, from starvation, from violence related to resource competition, these show up in whatever records exist. But the indirect deaths, the people whose weakened conditions made them susceptible to spring illnesses, the children who survived winter only to fade in the following months, these casualties blend into the general mortality statistics without attribution. Livestock losses devastated the regional economy. Cattle that represented years of accumulated wealth vanished in single storms, their frozen corpses revealed when spring finally arrived. The financial losses cascaded through communities, affecting not just individual farmers, but the merchants who supplied them, the banks that financed them, the entire economic ecosystem that depended on agricultural success. Recovery would take years for those who stayed to attempt it. The winter of 1856 to 57 taught harsh lessons about the limits of settlement ambition. There were places, it turned out, where farming bordered on the impossible, where climate represented an obstacle that determination and hard work couldn't overcome. This didn't stop settlement. Nothing stopped settlement, but it did change the conversation about where to settle and how to prepare. The survivors carried their knowledge westward and northward, their stories a kind of immunization that protected at least some future settlers from making the same mistakes. But other settlers didn't listen, or didn't believe, or thought that surely things would be different for them. The frontier kept claiming victims who believed themselves exceptions to rules written in frozen blood. The howling wakes you sometime in the grey hours before dawn, a sound that seems to come from every direction at once. You lie in your bed listening, trying to determine whether this is wind or something else, something alive and hungry. The distinction matters. Wind threatens your shelter, wolves threaten everything. Predator-human conflict on the frontier followed predictable patterns shaped by a simple equation. When prey animals died during harsh winters, predators needed alternative food sources. and your livestock represented the most accessible alternative available. The wolves didn't choose conflict any more than you chose to be their target. Both parties simply occupied the same territory during times of scarcity, and nature took its course. Your first indication of wolf activity often comes from livestock behaviour rather than wolf sightings. The horses grow nervous, stamping and snorting at shadows. The cattle cluster together more tightly than usual, presenting a unified defence against threats they sense but you can't see. The chickens won't leave their coop even when you open the door and scatter feed. Animals read predator presence through signals invisible to human perception, and their anxiety becomes your warning system. The tracks appear after the next snowfall, large canine prints circling your homestead at distances that suggest reconnaissance rather than attack. Wolves are intelligent enough to assess threats before committing to action, smart enough to test defences before attempting to breach them. You study their tracks with a mixture of fear and reluctant respect, knowing that the creatures who made them are studying you in return. Protecting livestock from wolves requires resources and energy you can barely spare. Fences that serve adequately against cattle wandering provide no obstacle to wolves who can dig under or leap over most barriers. Enclosed structures work better, but keeping animals locked in sheds and barns all winter creates its own problems. Ventilation issues, crowding stress, increased disease transmission. You try to find a balance between predator protection and animal welfare, knowing you can't fully achieve either. The rifle becomes your constant companion during wolf winters. You carry it everywhere. Keep it loaded and within reach at all times. Accept the weight as the price of potential survival. When you visit the livestock, you scan the horizon constantly, looking for movement against the snow that might indicate approaching hunters. When you hear disturbances at night, you pull on boots and coat and venture into darkness that might contain anything. The gun provides comfort, but comfort isn't safety. One quirky aspect of frontier wolf encounters involves the animal's remarkable patience. Wolves could stalk a homestead for days or weeks, watching patterns, learning schedules, waiting for the single lapse in vigilance that would give them opportunity. You might relax after days without wolf sign, conclude that the pack had moved on, reduce your guard just slightly, and that would be when they struck. This patience made wolves seem almost supernatural to settlers who couldn't understand how predators always found the moment of weakness. The attacks, when they come, happen with shocking speed. One moment you're walking toward the barn, the next moment something large and fast is moving through your peripheral vision. The wolf takes down a sheep before you can raise your rifle, seizes a chicken before you can react, vanishes into the white landscape carrying your livelihood in its jaws. You fire after it, hitting nothing, the sound of the shot echoing uselessly across empty prairie. Historians still argue whether wolves represented genuine existential threats to frontier families, or whether fear exceeded actual danger. Attacks on adult humans were rare. Wolves generally preferred easier prey, but attacks on children occurred with enough frequency to justify some parental paranoia. The bigger issue was economic rather than physical. Each animal killed by wolves represented food you wouldn't eat, breeding stock you wouldn't have, resources you couldn't replace. Trapping and hunting wolves provided both protection and income. Wolf pelts had value, and many territories offered bounties on wolf carcasses that supplemented struggling farm revenues. You learned to set traps that wolves couldn't resist, to track across snow that recorded every movement, to read wolf behaviour well enough to predict where they'd be. Some farmers became skilled wolf hunters, their expertise adding an unexpected profession to their agricultural work. But the wolves kept coming. No matter how many you killed, more seemed to appear, drawn by the smell of livestock and the opportunity that winter created. The battle felt endless, each victory temporary, each winter a new campaign in a war you could never quite win. You killed wolves, wolves killed your animals. Both populations struggled through conditions that neither had chosen. The relationship between settlers and wolves carried symbolic weight beyond the immediate practical concerns. Wolves represented wilderness, the wild America that European-descended settlers were determined to tame. Killing wolves meant asserting civilization's dominance over nature's chaos. This symbolism made wolf killing feel virtuous even when the practical benefits were minimal. You were on the right side of history, fighting for progress, domesticating a continent that needed domestication. The wolves, of course, had no access to this symbolic framework. They were simply hungry, simply surviving, simply doing what wolves do when prey becomes scarce. Their winter desperation mirrored your own, their struggle for survival paralleling yours in ways that created kinship even as you fought each other. You were both creatures trying to make it to spring, both playing hands dealt by forces beyond your control. By late winter, wolf activity often peaked. The deer and elk that wolves normally hunted had either died or become too difficult to find in deep snow. Your livestock, by contrast, remained conveniently located and partially confined, essentially a wildlife feeding station subsidised by your labour. The wolves' boldness increased as their desperation grew. Attacks came closer to occupied buildings in daylight hours, with less regard for human presence that had previously deterred them. Spring arrived as liberation for everyone. Prey animals recovered, wolves dispersed, the desperate competition for resources eased. You surveyed your depleted herds and calculated losses, grateful for what survived while mourning what didn't. Until next winter, when the howling would begin again. Day 47 of Unbroken White, and the wolves are starting to talk to you. Not literally. You haven't lost your mind, not quite, not yet. But the wood creaks and settles in patterns that almost form words if you listen hard enough. You've been listening hard enough for weeks now. You've had nothing else to do but listen and watch the fire and count the remaining supplies and wonder whether spring will ever actually arrive. Cabin fever, that peculiarly frontier affliction, earned its name honestly through countless cases of psychological deterioration in isolated, snow-trapped households. The condition begins subtly enough: irritability, restlessness, difficulty concentrating on tasks that used to come easily. Then it progresses through stages of increasing dysfunction, from constant arguing with your confined family members to genuine perceptual disturbances that make you question your own sanity. The human brain, it turns out, requires stimulation that frontier winter cannot provide. You need variety in your environment, novelty in your experiences, social contacts beyond the same 5 faces you've seen every day for months. Deprived of these inputs, neural systems designed for richer environments start misbehaving. You see movement in your peripheral vision where nothing moves. You hear voices in ambient noise that contains no voices. You develop overwhelming urges to do things, walk outside, start fires, make sudden dramatic changes that common sense would prevent but cabin fever overrides. Family relationships deteriorate under the pressure of forced intimacy. Your spouse's minor habits become intolerable irritations, the way they chew, the particular quality of their snoring, trivial gestures that wouldn't register during normal times, but feel like deliberate provocations after months of close quarters. Children drive parents to distraction with their energy and noise and needs, while parents drive children to resentment with their arbitrary rules and impossible demands. Love remains underneath the friction, but love proves surprisingly insufficient when walls close in. One quirky manifestation of cabin fever involves obsessive focus on escape. You plan elaborate departures that you know you can't actually execute, walking to town despite 20-foot drifts, building sleds from cabin furniture, simply running into the white until either you reach somewhere else or the cold ends the matter. These fantasies provide temporary relief, mental vacations from physical imprisonment, even when you understand they're impossible. Sometimes understanding isn't enough, and people actually attempt their impossible escapes with predictable results. Historians still argue whether frontier isolation produced genuine mental illness or simply exaggerated pre-existing tendencies. Modern psychology recognizes seasonal affective disorder, which certainly contributed to winter misery, but the frontier version involved factors that artificial lighting can't address. The combination of darkness, cold, hunger, fear, boredom, and social deprivation created psychological stresses that some minds simply couldn't handle. Breakdowns occurred, complete dissociations from reality that left formerly functional people unable to care for themselves or their families. Violence sadly sometimes followed psychological deterioration. Frontier newspapers occasionally reported on murders committed during winter isolation, cases where accumulated strain finally exceeded tolerance and someone died as a result. These incidents were rare enough to be newsworthy, but common enough to represent a recognised pattern. You kept watch on your family members' mental states, noting warning signs, trying to intervene before irritation became rage, before rage became irreversible action. Suicide represented another grim outcome of prolonged isolation. The hopelessness that accumulated over months of confinement, combined with easy access to firearms and other means, created conditions that modern psychologists would recognise as high risk. Frontier communities developed informal surveillance systems for this concern. Neighbours checking on neighbours during thaws, ministers making rounds when possible, anyone capable of travel visiting those suspected of struggling. These interventions helped sometimes, failed sometimes, and sometimes arrived too late. Children proved surprisingly resilient to cabin fever in some respects, more vulnerable in others. Their capacity for imaginative play allowed them to create mental stimulation that adults couldn't access, transforming the same four walls into castles, jungles, sailing ships on endless seas. But their need for physical activity exceeded what confined spaces could provide, leaving them bouncing off walls that were all too literal. Parents faced impossible choices between allowing dangerous outdoor play and managing indoor chaos that frayed everyone's nerves. The social customs that developed around cabin fever reflected practical wisdom accumulated over generations. You learned to give each other space even in close quarters, to observe periods of designated silence, to develop signals indicating need for solitude. You learned to ration conversation as carefully as you rationed food, saving topics for when morale needed boosting rather than wasting them in early winter when spirit still held. You learned, in short, to survive together, because surviving apart wasn't an option. Reading materials became treasured possessions far beyond their intrinsic literary value. A single book might be read dozens of times during a long winter, its contents memorised, its pages worn thin from constant handling. Newspapers arrived months late but provided precious connection to a wider world, their outdated news still more interesting than no news at all. Some families conducted reading circles, taking turns reading aloud to conserve candles while providing entertainment. The voice of someone reading broke the silence in ways that private reading couldn't match. Music and singing offered another psychological survival tool. Hymns, folk songs, children's rhymes, anything that introduced variety into the monotonous soundscape of winter confinement. Families fortunate enough to possess instruments held concerts that lifted spirits and marked time. Those without instruments created percussion from available materials, harmonicas from mail-order catalogues, voices lifted in songs that had sustained their ancestors through difficulties centuries before. You emerge from cabin fever eventually, either because spring arrives or because you achieve some psychological adaptation that allows continued function. The emergence feels like waking from a fever dream, the world snapping back into focus, the walls retreating to their proper proportions. You look at your family with fresh eyes, apologise for harsh words spoken during dark times, rebuild relationships that isolation had strained. Until next winter, when the walls will start talking again, the train sits motionless on tracks buried under drifts so high you can barely see the smokestack. You're somewhere in the middle of what promotional materials called the Garden of the West, though the view from your frozen window suggests different agricultural metaphors. Snow has fallen for 3 days straight, the wind has piled it higher than the locomotive, and no amount of steam power is going to move this train until conditions change or someone digs you out. So you wait, huddled with other passengers in cars that grow colder by the hour as fuel runs low. Railroads promise to tame frontier distances, connecting isolated settlements to markets and supplies, and the civilizing benefits of regular commerce. The advertisements showed happy travellers gliding across the plains in comfortable cars, arriving at destinations on predictable schedules. What the advertisements didn't show, couldn't show, was what happened when winter disagreed with those schedules. Snow removal from railroad tracks in the 19th century relied primarily on human muscle and animal power. Crews of men with shovels attacked drifts that reformed almost as fast as they could be cleared. Horse-drawn ploughs pushed snow aside when drifts were manageable, though the horses themselves became victims when conditions exceeded their limits. The railroad companies maintained small armies of workers for winter operations, but those armies were often insufficient against determined blizzards. The rotary snowplow, that magnificent spiral-bladed machine that could chew through drifts like some industrial beast, didn't reach widespread deployment until the 1880s. Before then, clearing methods remained primitive, labour-intensive and frequently unsuccessful. A track might take days or weeks to reopen after a major storm, leaving trains stranded at remote locations where neither passengers nor crew could easily be reached. Your train carries a diverse cargo of humanity. Settlers heading west with everything they own, businessmen travelling to investments, mail carriers with correspondence that will arrive very late indeed, soldiers transferring between posts. Everyone has somewhere to be. and nobody is going to get there. The democracy of disaster levels social distinctions that normally stratify train travel. Rich and poor alike face the same cold, the same hunger, the same uncertainty about what happens next. The conductor assures passengers that rescue will come, that crews are certainly working toward your position, that the company will not abandon paying customers to freeze. His confidence would be more reassuring if his voice didn't waver, if his own supplies weren't clearly running low, if he seemed to believe his own words. You've been assured before, by pamphlet writers and land speculators and everyone else who profited from your westward movement. The assurances start to feel like a specific genre of frontier fiction. One quirky feature of railroad winter emergencies was the improvised survival techniques that passengers developed. Food supplies ran out quickly on stranded trains, but the trains themselves carried materials that could be repurposed. Wooden seats for fuel, upholstery for insulation, cargo of various kinds that might include edibles or tradable goods. Passengers shared whatever they had, creating temporary economies where a bottle of whiskey might trade for a wool blanket, where children received food before adults without any formal agreement establishing the practice. Historians still argue whether railroad companies bore adequate responsibility for winter preparedness, or whether the conditions simply exceeded reasonable anticipation. The companies argued the latter, positioning themselves as victims of unprecedented weather, against which no profitable precaution could have protected. Critics noted that the companies had been warned, had faced similar conditions in previous years, had simply chosen profits over passenger safety. The truth likely included elements of both positions. Telegraph lines that paralleled the railroad tracks provided theoretical communication capability, but those lines proved just as vulnerable to winter as the tracks themselves. Ice accumulated on wires until their weight brought them down. Poles snapped under wind pressure or were buried by drifts that made them impossible to repair. A stranded train might be incommunicado for days, its position unknown to anyone who might send help, its passengers growing more desperate with each passing hour. The mail service failures caused by railroad interruptions created cascading problems throughout frontier communities. Letters that should have arrived in December might not appear until March, bearing news that was no longer current, requests that had been superseded by events, announcements that had become irrelevant. Business suffered from contracts that couldn't be negotiated, payments that couldn't be delivered, information that couldn't flow. The railroad that promised to connect the frontier instead revealed the fragility of those connections. Supply chains dependent on railroad reliability collapsed during severe winters. Towns that had stopped maintaining large stockpiles, why bother when the train brought goods regularly, suddenly found themselves without essentials. Merchants who had placed orders expecting timely delivery watched their customers' needs go unmet, while freight cars sat snowbound miles away. The just-in-time inventory management that modern businesses would later develop was imposed on 19th century communities by circumstance rather than choice, with results that demonstrated why stockpiling had traditionally been prudent. Your train eventually moves again. They always do, eventually, but the experience leaves passengers shaken. The frontier that seemed so promising from comfortable eastern cities reveals its teeth during the days you spent wondering whether help would arrive. Some passengers continue their westward journeys with chastened expectations. Others turn back at the next opportunity, concluding that wherever they were going isn't worth the risk of getting stuck again. The railroad that was supposed to make frontier life possible instead demonstrates its impossibility for the faint of heart. The railroad companies learned from these disasters, slowly, expensively, one crisis at a time. They built section houses along their tracks, small stations where stranded passengers could find shelter and supplies. They invested in better snowplows, larger work crews, more robust communication systems. They learned to cancel runs when conditions became truly impossible, rather than sending trains into storms they couldn't survive. But learning took time, and during that time, trains kept getting stuck and passengers kept suffering the consequences. Winter and the railroad fought to a standstill, season after season, the machine age not yet powerful enough to overcome the elemental force that had been there first. The winter of 1880 to 81 announces itself early, arriving in October with storms that should belong to January. You notice, of course, everyone in the Dakota Territory notices. But October storms aren't unprecedented, unusual certainly, concerning perhaps, but not necessarily harbingers of the nightmare about to unfold. The first blizzard strikes October 15th, coating the landscape in white earlier than any living memory recalls. Cattle that should be fattening on autumn grass instead hunker against winds that carry genuine killing cold. Farmers who plan to finish their preparations find themselves suddenly out of time, scrambling to accomplish in days what should have taken weeks. The storm passes, leaving damage but not disaster, and everyone hopes it represents an aberration rather than a pattern. It represents a pattern. The storms keep coming with a regularity that seems almost deliberate, each one building on the last, each one depositing snow that previous storms prevent from melting. By November, the snow on the ground measures in feet rather than inches. By December, it reaches levels that experienced settlers have never seen. The landscape transforms into something lunar, familiar features buried under white that reflects moonlight with almost supernatural brightness. The phenomenon that will become known as the hard winter or snow winter operates on a continental scale that individual observation cannot fully grasp. Atmospheric conditions have aligned in ways that funnel Arctic air directly into the plains, that organise moisture into storm after storm, that create what modern meteorologists would recognise as an exceptional pattern persistence event. You don't have those terms. You don't have any terms. You only have the experience of storm after storm after storm. Transportation shuts down almost immediately and stays shut down. The trains that have revolutionised prairie life simply stop running. Tracks buried under drifts that no available snowplow can clear. Roads that might be passable after ordinary storms vanish completely, their locations identifiable only by fence posts that mark former boundaries. Travel between towns becomes impossible. Travel between homesteads becomes dangerous. Travel between your house and your barn becomes an adventure that might end in death. One quirky survival technique that emerged during the hard winter involved ropes strung between buildings. A farmer would tie one end to his house and the other to his barn, creating a lifeline that could be followed through whiteout conditions. Those who didn't install ropes quickly discovered their necessity. The stories of settlers found frozen within feet of their own doors, disoriented by visibility that dropped to zero, became cautionary tales passed among neighbours during the brief opportunities for communication. Fuel supplies prove catastrophically inadequate. You've stored what seemed like sufficient wood and coal based on ordinary winters, but ordinary winters don't feature continuous storms and temperatures that hover well below zero for weeks at a stretch. You burn through your supplies at rates that guarantee exhaustion well before spring, then start burning things that aren't really meant to be burned. Furniture goes into the stove, books go in, floorboards get pried up when other options run out. Food presents similar mathematics. You've prepared for a normal winter's isolation, not for a season when resupply becomes completely impossible. Rationing that seemed reasonable in November becomes desperate by January, adequate portions shrinking to starvation levels as supplies dwindle, with no prospect of replenishment. The calculations acquire terrible clarity. This much food, this many people, this many days until spring. The numbers don't work, and no amount of recalculation makes them work. Historians still argue about the ultimate death toll from the hard winter, their disagreements reflecting inadequate records and competing definitions of causation. People who died during storms count obviously. People who died of starvation count mostly. People who died from weakened conditions in following months. Where do you draw the line? The estimates range from dozens to hundreds, depending on methodology and geographic scope. Whatever the true number, it was too high. The psychological toll exceeds even the physical hardship. Previous winters ended eventually, opening windows of relief between storms, offering hope that the worst had passed. This winter offers no such respite. Storm follows storm without meaningful pause, the brief periods between blizzards serving only to create new drifts from fallen snow before the next storm arrives to add more. Hope doesn't just diminish. It requires active maintenance against evidence that continues accumulating outside your window. Livestock mortality reaches catastrophic levels. Cattle that haven't frozen outright are starving, their feed supplies exhausted, their ability to forage completely eliminated by snow depths that bury any remaining grass. Ranchers who built their futures on cattle watch those futures die, one frozen carcass at a time. Some attempt to drive herds to imagined safety. The drives become death marches, animals dropping along trails that survivors can't complete. Children born during the hard winter enter the world under conditions that maximize infant mortality. Cold cabins, malnourished mothers, limited medical assistance, Compromised immune systems. Every factor works against newborn survival. The baptisms happen quickly when they happen at all. Insurance against dying unnamed and unsanctified. Small graves multiply in family plots that the frozen ground barely allows to be dug. The community bonds that normally sustain frontier families fray under impossible strain. Neighbours who would ordinarily help each other have nothing to spare. Their own survival requires every resource they possess. The social contracts that make isolated settlement viable require occasional surplus to share, and the hard winter eliminates all surplus. You're on your own in ways that even frontier individualism didn't anticipate, and still the storms keep coming. Each time you think surely this must be the last, surely the sky has exhausted its ammunition, another mass of cold and snow appears on the horizon and proves you wrong again. January becomes February becomes March, and still winter refuses to release its grip. You've never seen anything like it. Nobody has ever seen anything like it. The hard winter earns its name through repetition that seems designed to break the human spirit entirely. Spring, when it finally arrives, will reveal the full extent of the disaster. But that's months away, and you don't know if you'll survive to see it. The 7th blizzard of January arrives 3 days after the 6th one finally exhausted itself. You've stopped hoping for relief between storms. Hope has become a luxury you can't afford, an expenditure of emotional energy that produces no return. Instead, you operate on a kind of grim automation, doing what needs to be done, conserving what can be conserved, waiting for conditions that basic meteorology suggests must eventually arrive even if current evidence argues otherwise. Your supplies follow predictable trajectories towards zero. The flour barrel that seemed adequate in October sits 3/4 empty, and January isn't over yet. The salt pork you'd carefully preserved provides diminishing meals that leave everyone hungry. The potatoes in the root cellar have begun sprouting despite the cold, their nutritional value decreasing with each passing day of storage. You count and recount, hoping the numbers will change, knowing they won't. Twisted hay becomes your primary fuel when wood and coal supplies finally exhaust themselves. The technique involves exactly what the name suggests, taking loose hay and twisting it into tight bundles that burn hot enough to provide temporary heat. The operative word is temporary. Hay burns fast, requiring constant feeding of the fire that leaves little time for other activities. You and your family members take shifts. One person always awake, always twisting, always feeding the insatiable fire that stands between survival and freezing. The labour of hay-twisting leaves hands raw and bleeding. The rough stems cut skin already weakened by cold and malnutrition, creating wounds that heal slowly if they heal at all. Your palms become landscapes of cuts and calluses, physical maps of your desperate effort to stay warm. The children twist what they can, their smaller hands less efficient but essential when adult hands simply can't continue. Everyone contributes because everyone must contribute. One quirky aspect of hay burning is the smell, a pleasant agricultural scent that seems wildly inappropriate for the circumstances producing it. Your cabin fills with the aroma of a summer barn, a sensory disconnect that some survivors later described as dreamlike. The hay smell mixed with whatever else burned, furniture legs, floorboards, the covers of books whose contents had already been exhausted, creating an olfactory record of desperation. The hunger becomes constant background noise, a physical sensation that never fully recedes. You grow accustomed to it in the way you grow accustomed to chronic pain, developing tolerance without achieving relief. Meals provide temporary respite rather than satisfaction, fuel for bodies that continue demanding more than you can provide. You dream about food with hallucinatory vividness, waking to find your mouth watering over imaginary feasts. Historians still argue whether any preventive measures could have adequately prepared settlers for the hard winter. Critics note that better food storage, larger fuel supplies, and sturdier construction would have reduced casualties. Defenders respond that the hard winter exceeded reasonable planning parameters, that no amount of preparation could have addressed its unprecedented severity. The argument continues because it touches fundamental questions about responsibility. Who was at fault for the suffering, and what could have been done differently? News of deaths reaches you through the informal networks that still function despite the isolation. When storms briefly pause, those capable of travel venture out, returning with reports from neighbouring homesteads. The Johnson family has lost their youngest. The Petersons haven't been seen since December. Someone needs to check on them when conditions allow. The Andersons abandoned their claim entirely. though nobody knows where they went or whether they survived the journey. Each report adds weight to your own fear. The cattle are all dead now, or nearly so. The magnificent herd that represented your financial future lies scattered across pastures that you can't even see under the snow. Some animals drifted for miles before dropping. You'll find their corpses spread across the countryside when spring finally arrives. Others huddled against fences, pressing together for warmth that couldn't save them, dying in groups whose frozen bodies will require significant effort to move. The investment of years vanishes in weeks. Horses receive slightly better treatment than cattle, their utility for potential escape or rescue earning them priority access to diminishing hay supplies. But horses can't survive on hay alone during extreme cold. They need grain that's no longer available, and the hard-worked animals grow thin despite your best efforts. You watch them weaken and know that if you need to flee, your transportation might not be capable of carrying you far enough to matter. Children adapt to circumstances in ways that adults find both inspiring and heartbreaking. They create games from the endless indoor confinement, construct imaginary worlds that overlay the grim reality of their actual world, find moments of joy that adult consciousness can no longer access. They're also old enough to understand danger, old enough to read their parents' faces, old enough to worry in ways that children shouldn't have to worry. The burden of appearing calm for children's benefit adds exhaustion to everything else you're managing. Religious faith provides comfort for some families. Its promises of divine purpose giving meaning to suffering that otherwise appears random. Other families find their faith eroding under the weight of evidence. What kind of God allows this, permits innocent children to freeze, watches the righteous starve while doing nothing? The theological arguments that have occupied humanity for millennia become intensely personal during the hard winter, abstract questions about theodicy acquiring immediate urgent relevance. Your body begins consuming itself. Without adequate nutrition, metabolic processes turn to stored fat, then to muscle, then to wherever else they can find fuel. You grow weak, movements requiring effort that wouldn't have registered months ago. The cold feels colder because you have less insulation. Injuries heal more slowly. Infections that healthy systems would fight off find compromised immune systems that can't mount adequate defences. The hunger isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous in ways that compound over time. And still the storms keep coming, relentless, seemingly eternal, each one adding to drifts that already exceed anything you'd imagined possible. You've probably heard the name Laura Ingalls Wilder, though you might not immediately connect it to the hard winter. She was there, a 13-year-old girl living with her family in De Smet, Dakota Territory, experiencing the same storms you're experiencing, facing the same privations, surviving through the same desperate measures. Her later books would transform the hard winter into literary memory, preserving details that might otherwise have been lost to time. The Ingalls family represented one small data point in a vast disaster, their story distinguished primarily by the fact that someone wrote it down. Hundreds of other families faced identical circumstances, the same bone-chilling cold, the same endless storms, the same dwindling supplies, without leaving written records that future generations would read. Their stories survive only in fragments. A diary entry here, a letter there, an oral tradition passed down until it faded from living memory. Almanzo Wilder, who would later marry Laura, made seed wheat runs during the hard winter that quite possibly saved the town of De Smet from starvation. The supplies brought by train had stopped coming. The stored supplies had run out. The townspeople faced genuine famine unless someone found additional food sources. Almanzo and a companion travelled 20 miles through terrible conditions to purchase wheat from a farmer who had surplus, then hauled it back across frozen prairie that offered countless opportunities for disaster. One quirky detail from the Ingalls hard winter experience involves the family's creative approach to food preparation. With wheat, but limited other ingredients, they developed variations on basic bread and porridge that the children grew thoroughly sick of. Laura later wrote about the monotony of wheat-based meals, with a vividness that suggests genuine trauma. The body survived, but the palate suffered terribly, and decades later the memory of that suffering remained fresh. The social dynamics of trapped communities during the hard winter created both unity and conflict. People who ordinarily had little to do with each other found themselves dependent on the same limited resources. Decisions about rationing, about rescue attempts, about who got help first when help became available, all created friction that normal times would have diffused. Historians still argue whether frontier communities demonstrated unusual solidarity during the hard winter, or whether the crisis revealed existing tensions that prosperity had concealed. The railroad company promised help that proved impossible to deliver. Corporate headquarters issued reassuring statements, while crews proved entirely incapable of clearing tracks against storms that refilled cuts as fast as they could be dug. The gap between institutional promises and individual experience created bitter memories that would influence regional politics for generations. When people were dying, statements about working hard to restore service felt like insults. Children's adaptations to hard winter conditions often centered on activity reduction. Play that involved running and jumping gave way to quieter games that conserved precious calories. Stories and songs replaced physical recreation, imagination substituting for movement. The enforced stillness suited some children's temperaments while torturing others, creating behavioural patterns that parents had neither time nor energy to address adequately. The medical emergencies that arose during the hard winter couldn't be properly treated. When someone developed appendicitis, or suffered a severe injury, or encountered any of dozens of conditions that required professional intervention, no professional could be reached. Families made do with folk remedies, prayer, and desperate hope. Some patients survived despite inadequate care, others didn't. The death toll includes casualties of conditions that would have been manageable in other circumstances. The hard winter created strange intimacies between neighbours. Families that might have socialised once or twice a month suddenly shared survival strategies, pooled resources, traded labour on a near-daily basis when conditions permitted any movement at all. Relationships that would normally have remained cordial but distant became close through mutual dependency. Bonds formed during that winter lasted lifetimes, creating social networks that shaped communities long after the physical danger had passed. Animals besides livestock suffered their own catastrophes. Wildlife populations plummeted as prey animals starved, and predators followed them into death. Deer, rabbits, and birds died by thousands, their frozen bodies appearing when spring finally exposed what winter had hidden. The ecological impact persisted for years, hunting poor for a decade after as populations slowly rebuilt from devastated numbers. The economic aftermath of the hard winter would reshape Dakota Territory for a generation. Livestock losses represented not just immediate hardship, but years of rebuilding. Cattle that died in 1881 couldn't produce calves in 1882 or beyond. Farmers who arrived hopeful and invested heavily found themselves bankrupt, their dreams of prosperity frozen along with their herds. Some recovered eventually, many didn't. The psychological aftermath proved equally persistent. Survivors carried trauma that manifested in various ways: hoarding behaviours, anxiety about weather changes, difficulty trusting institutions that had failed them during their time of need. Some became obsessive preparers, maintaining supplies far exceeding any reasonable requirement. Others developed a fatalism that accepted disaster as normal, their expectations of life permanently diminished. Laura Ingalls would eventually process her hard winter experiences through fiction, creating a narrative that has shaped how millions of readers understand the frontier experience. Her story, while true in its essentials, necessarily represented one family's perspective on an event that encompassed thousands of families. The stories that weren't written, the perspectives that weren't preserved, the voices that weren't heard. These constitute an absence that no subsequent research can fully address. The hard winter ended, as all winters do eventually, but while it lasted it felt eternal, and the people who survived it never forgot what eternity had felt like. The furniture burns with a certain nobility, chairs and tables sacrificing themselves to keep their owners alive. You watch pieces that your family hauled across the prairie go into the stove one leg at a time, their destruction necessary but somehow still heartbreaking. The rocking chair where you nursed your children, the table where you've shared hundreds of meals, the bed frame that supported decades of sleep and intimacy. All fuel now, all smoke rising through a chimney that struggles against wind determined to push it back down. The hierarchy of what gets burned develops organically, without formal discussion. Items with purely functional value go first: extra shelving, storage boxes, things that can be replaced without significant emotional cost. Items with sentimental value hold out longer, preserved as long as possible by families who understand that survival requires sacrifice, but hope to minimize the sacrifice required. Finally, When nothing else remains, even the treasured pieces feed the fire, books represent a particular sacrifice. The frontier family with books, and many families had at least a few, a Bible certainly, perhaps some novels or almanacs or practical guides, faces a decision between knowledge and warmth. The paper burns well, provides good momentary heat, but disappears quickly and permanently. You try to read each book one final time before committing it to flames, absorbing whatever wisdom or entertainment it offers, before that offering becomes literally smoke. Some pages get saved. Favourite passages, important family records, tucked into pockets while the rest burns. Floorboards become fuel when other options exhaust themselves. You pull them up one at a time, exposing the frozen ground beneath, trading structural integrity for immediate warmth. The cabin develops gaps that let cold in from below, somewhat defeating the purpose of burning the boards that created those gaps. But somewhat defeating the purpose is better than completely freezing, so you keep pulling boards, keep burning them, keep accepting the trade-offs that survival requires. One quirky innovation that developed during the hard winter involved burning dried corn cobs, which provided reasonable heat and were available in quantity on many farms. The corn itself had been consumed, or had been reserved for final resort eating, but the cobs accumulated in piles that now acquired value. Cob fires burned hotter than hay but cooler than wood, finding a middle ground in the frontier fuel hierarchy. Historians still argue about the long-term economic impact of fuel-burning desperation. Items destroyed for heat represented accumulated wealth. Furniture had to be purchased or built, books had to be acquired, floorboards had to be milled and installed. Families who survived the hard winter often emerged materially poorer than they'd entered it, their homes stripped of everything combustible, their possessions reduced to whatever metal and stone wouldn't burn. Rebuilding this lost wealth took years that some families couldn't afford. The twisted hay technique mentioned earlier deserves additional attention for its sheer ingenuity. Loose hay burns too fast to provide useful heat. It flares up and vanishes almost immediately. But hay twisted into tight bundles burns more slowly, the compressed fibres releasing their energy gradually. The optimal twist creates ropes perhaps 3 inches in diameter, tight enough to slow combustion, but not so tight that air can't reach the interior. Mastering this technique meant the difference between useful heat and wasted fuel. Children participated in hay twisting as a matter of necessity, their labour essential even when their hands weren't strong enough to produce optimal results. The family that burned through supplies fastest was the family without enough hands to keep the fire fed. Children too young for meaningful twist quality still contributed by gathering and organising loose hay, preparing materials for adults whose hands were already bleeding from continuous work. The smell of desperation has many components, but during the hard winter it prominently featured the odours of improvised fuels. Hay smoke differs from wood smoke, which differs from furniture smoke, which differs from book smoke. Each combustible announced its sacrifice through a distinctive scent. Survivors later reported that certain smells triggered intense memories. The smell of burning paper decades later, bringing back the hard winter with hallucinatory force. The calories expended twisting hay to burn for heat that allowed the body to survive required food that was increasingly unavailable, a metabolic paradox that wore people down. You needed to eat to have strength to twist, to have heat to survive, to eat to twist to burn. When food supplies dropped below sustaining levels, the capacity for fuel preparation dropped with them. Some families reached the point where they couldn't prepare adequate fuel even when materials remained available. The choice between burning essential items and freezing sometimes resolved itself through circumstances rather than decisions. When someone became too weak to twist hay, when supplies dropped below survival thresholds, when the terrible mathematics simply didn't allow any solution, families faced outcomes they hadn't chosen but couldn't avoid. The judgment of survivors about those who didn't survive remains complicated, combining compassion with the uncomfortable awareness that different choices might have produced different results. Spring would eventually return wood availability and end the desperate burning of household items. But spring lay months away, invisible beyond storms that continued without apparent end. You focused on immediate survival, on today's warmth, on tonight's fire, because thinking about next month or next week produced only despair. The furniture kept burning, one piece at a time, purchasing hours and days of continued existence at costs that the future would reveal. The fire crackled on, consuming history to create a future, and you twisted more hay because stopping wasn't an option. January 12th, 1888 begins bright and warm for January on the northern plains, temperatures rising into the 20s and 30s, a welcome respite from the bitter cold that has gripped the region. Children who have been trapped inside for days beg to go outside, and parents, grateful for the break, agree. Schools that have been closed due to weather reopen their doors. Farmers venture out to check on livestock they haven't been able to reach. The winter seems, for one blessed moment, to be easing its grip. It isn't. What's actually happening is far more dangerous than continued cold. A massive cold front is racing across the plains from Canada, carrying temperatures that will drop 40 to 50 degrees in minutes. The warm morning isn't relief, it's bait. The pleasant weather that lured people outdoors has positioned them perfectly for what happens next. The storm arrives around noon in Nebraska, slightly later in Dakota Territory, with a ferocity that witnesses described as explosive. One moment, relative calm. The next moment, wind, snow, and temperatures that turn exposed flesh to ice. The transition occurs so quickly that people caught outside have no time to seek shelter, no warning that might have allowed preparation. The weather simply changes instantly, totally, and anyone not already indoors faces a suddenly life-threatening situation. You might be in the fields checking fences when it hits. The wind arrives first, a wall of air that nearly knocks you off your feet. Then the temperature drops, and keeps dropping, cold biting through clothing that was adequate for the morning's mild conditions but offers nothing against this assault. Finally comes the snow, horizontal and blinding, reducing visibility to zero, obliterating every familiar landmark that might guide you home. One quirky meteorological detail: the storm arrived as what's called a cold front occlusion, where cold air undercuts slightly less cold air, creating powerful vertical atmospheric circulation. This structure produced the sudden temperature drops that made the blizzard so deadly. The warming that preceded the storm wasn't just coincidental, it was part of the same system. The atmosphere creating conditions that maximised both the number of people outdoors and the danger those people faced. The children. That's what makes this storm different from others, what earns it the name Schoolchildren's Blizzard in historical memory. Thousands of children were in schools across the region when the blizzard struck, and those schools suddenly became crucial decisions. Do you keep the children inside, hoping the building provides adequate shelter? Or do you attempt to send them home, hoping they can reach their families before conditions deteriorate further? Different teachers made different choices, and those choices proved matters of life and death. Some teachers kept their students in the schoolhouse, burning furniture for heat, surviving in crowded, cold, but ultimately adequate shelter. Other teachers attempted to lead their students home, believing that reaching parents provided the safest option. The second choice required travelling through conditions that proved lethal for many. Historians still argue about the decisions individual teachers made, their arguments complicated by hindsight that wasn't available in the moment. Teachers who kept students inside and survived get credited with wisdom. Teachers who kept students inside and ran out of fuel, whose buildings collapsed, whose charges froze anyway. History has been less kind to their memory. The same decision produced different outcomes based on factors no one could have predicted or controlled. The visibility dropped to essentially nothing. Children who set out for homes a quarter-mile away couldn't see their destination, couldn't see landmarks, couldn't see their own hands in front of their faces. They walked in what they thought were correct directions, their sense of orientation failing against disorientation that the whiteout conditions produced. Some walked in circles. Some walked past their destinations without knowing it. Some simply walked until they couldn't walk anymore. The sounds of that afternoon haunt survivors. Children calling for help that couldn't come, parents shouting for children who couldn't hear them, the wind overwhelming everything with its endless howl. Communication became impossible across distances of more than a few feet. Rescue attempts failed because rescuers couldn't find those who needed rescue, couldn't even see the people freezing within yards of their search paths. The death toll accumulated with terrible speed. Children froze within sight of buildings they couldn't see. Teachers froze protecting students whose lives they valued more than their own. Farmers froze searching for livestock or for family members they couldn't locate. The storm killed indiscriminately, taking the young and old, the prepared and unprepared, the fortunate and unfortunate with equal brutality. By the time the storm ended, more than 200 people were dead, though exact numbers remain disputed. Many victims were children, their small bodies losing heat faster than adult bodies, their limited navigation experience offering less resistance to disorientation. The Schoolchildren's blizzard entered historical memory as something close to a natural atrocity, a disaster that specifically targeted the innocent. The morning's warmth, in retrospect, constitutes the cruelest aspect of the disaster. Had the day begun cold, children would have stayed home, farmers would have remained inside, the death toll would have been far lower. The pleasant weather functioned as a trap, luring people into position for the kill that followed. Survivors understood this dynamic, understood that the nice morning had made everything worse, understood that trusting pleasant conditions had been a fatal error. The infrastructure for weather prediction that might have warned people simply didn't exist yet. No forecasting service tracked the cold front racing south. No communication network could have spread warnings fast enough to matter. The people who died had no way to know danger was coming, no tools that could have protected them. They were victims of a disaster that better technology might have prevented, dying at the threshold of an era when such prevention would become possible. Minnie Freeman became a legend before the storm had fully ended. The young schoolteacher, just 19 years old, faced the impossible when the blizzard tore the roof off her one-room schoolhouse in Mirror Valley, Nebraska. 16 children looked to her for salvation that she had no obvious means to provide. What she did next would make her famous throughout the nation. She tied her students together with twine, or so the legend goes, though the historical record on this detail proves somewhat murky, and led them through the blinding storm to a nearby shelter. All 16 children survived. The image of a young woman roping children together against the wind, leading them to safety through conditions that killed hundreds, captured something that Americans desperately wanted to believe, that courage and quick thinking could overcome even nature's worst. The reality, as reality usually does, complicated the legend. Some accounts suggest the rope was actually string from her apron. Others question whether any binding was used at all. The distance travelled, anywhere from a few hundred yards to over a mile depending on which source you trust, varies dramatically between tellings. Historians still argue about what exactly happened, their disagreements reflecting both inadequate contemporary documentation and subsequent embellishment of a story that served cultural purposes. But whether the details are precise or not, the essential truth remains. A young teacher kept 16 children alive through conditions that proved fatal for others. Her quick thinking, getting students out of a collapsing building, keeping them together, navigating to safety, represented exactly the kind of leadership that the disaster demanded. She became a celebrity, receiving marriage proposals from around the country, and the subject of songs and poems that celebrated her heroism. One quirky detail from Minnie Freeman's post-blizzard life: she married one of those distant suitors, moved away from Nebraska, and spent her remaining years somewhat uncomfortable with the fame that one afternoon had brought her. She gave interviews occasionally, but generally preferred privacy, the legend having a life independent of the person who had inspired it. Her story became bigger than her, which may have been both flattering and burdensome. Other teachers made similar decisions with different outcomes. Lois Royce, teaching in a school near Plainview, Nebraska, tried to lead her 3 students to safety, but lost her way in the storm. They sheltered in a haystack where Royce placed the children between her body and the wind, protecting them with her own flesh. The children survived with varying degrees of frostbite. Royce lost both her feet to the cold, a sacrifice she apparently considered worthwhile for the lives she'd saved. The teacher martyrs of the Schoolchildren's blizzard included several who didn't survive their attempts to save students. Etta Shattuck, teaching near Holt County, Nebraska, froze to death after becoming lost while trying to reach her boarding house. Her body was found the next day, positioned as if she'd been walking purposefully toward a destination she couldn't see. She was 21 years old, and her death left 3 children orphaned, a detail that adds bitter irony to her dying while trying to protect other people's children. Students who survived the blizzard carried memories that shaped their entire lives. Many refused to discuss the experience, the trauma too raw for verbal processing. Others became compulsive storytellers, repeating the tale until it achieved a kind of protective distance. The psychological impact on children who watched classmates die, who survived only through luck or circumstance, who faced mortality before reaching maturity, this impact defies easy description, but appears throughout survivor accounts. The parents of lost children experienced grief that no parent should have to bear. You sent your child to school on a pleasant January morning, expecting them home by afternoon, and they never came home at all. The searches began as soon as the storm allowed. Frantic parents combing drifts for small bodies, hoping against evidence to find survivors. Some searches succeeded, many didn't. The bodies appeared gradually, their locations revealing the paths that disorientation had forced upon them. Community responses to the disaster varied, but often centred on memorials and prevention. Stones were erected, services held, names recorded so that the dead might be remembered, even after everyone who knew them personally had also died. Schools implemented new protocols about weather decisions, though the technology for meaningful weather prediction remained years away. The schoolchildren's blizzard forced recognition that trusting pleasant mornings was insufficient, but offered no practical alternative to trust. The stories multiplied in the telling, acquiring details that reflected storytellers' needs more than historical accuracy. The teacher who kept her students warm by burning her own furniture, the children who survived by huddling in a buffalo wallow, the farmer who rescued stranded travellers by following his dog. Some stories were true, some embellished, some entirely invented, but all served the purpose of finding meaning in disaster, of insisting that human action mattered even when nature demonstrated its overwhelming power. The winter of 1887 to 88 had already been difficult before the schoolchildren's blizzard made it legendary. Ranchers had lost thousands of cattle to earlier storms. The economy of the northern plains was already strained. The January 12th disaster didn't create frontier hardship. It concentrated and dramatised hardship that was already present. The children who died became symbols of a larger suffering that statistics couldn't capture. January 13th dawned clear and brutally cold, the storm's aftermath revealing what the storm itself had hidden. Bodies emerged from drifts. Survivors told their stories. The counting began, of dead, of injured, of property destroyed, of lives permanently altered. The schoolchildren's blizzard entered the historical record, its name ensuring that the primary victims would never be forgotten, even as individual names faded from memory. Less than 2 months after the schoolchildren's blizzard killed hundreds on the northern plains, a different kind of monster targets the nation's largest city. The Great Blizzard of March 1888 hits the eastern seaboard with a force that makes New York, Boston, and Philadelphia suddenly understand what their frontier cousins have been experiencing. The sophisticated urbanites who perhaps dismissed prairie blizzard stories as exaggeration get their own demonstration of winter's power. The storm arrives March 11th and continues through March 14th, dumping up to 50 inches of snow on the northeastern United States. Unlike prairie blizzards, which kill through exposure across vast distances, this storm kills through infrastructure collapse in densely populated areas. The city that prides itself on modernity discovers how quickly modernity can fail when confronted with determined weather. New York City essentially ceases to function. Streets become impassable, buried under snow that ploughs can't clear and citizens can't traverse. The elevated railways that represent the cutting edge of urban transportation stop running entirely, their exposed tracks and platforms impossible to maintain. Telegraph and telephone lines, the communication marvels of the age, collapse under ice and wind, cutting the city off from the outside world. For several days, New York becomes as isolated as any frontier homestead. You might be caught in this storm on your way to work, the morning commute having seemed entirely possible when you left home. The weather was poor but not impassable, or so you thought. Then conditions deteriorated faster than you could adapt, and now you're somewhere in lower Manhattan, unable to move forward or back, seeking shelter in whatever building will admit you. The democracy of disaster operates in cities too. Financiers shelter alongside labourers, their social distinctions irrelevant against cold that threatens everyone equally. One quirky detail from the Great Blizzard involves the massive snowdrifts that formed between buildings, wind patterns creating accumulations of 40 or 50 feet in narrow streets, while leaving adjacent areas relatively clear. People tunnelled through these drifts, creating snow caves that provided both shelter and transportation routes. The visual record of the storm includes photographs of men standing on snow that reaches second-story windows, the scale almost impossible to believe even with documentary evidence. The death toll reaches approximately 400 in the northeastern storm, though counting methods varied and some estimates run higher. Unlike the schoolchildren's blizzard, which killed many victims in open country, the Great Blizzard killed people in the heart of civilization, on city streets, in stuck elevated cars, in buildings whose heating failed. the implicit promise of urban safety, the assumption that city infrastructure would protect against natural disaster, died alongside human victims. Historians still argue about what the Great Blizzard revealed about American urban development. The infrastructure that failed, elevated railways, above-ground wires, street-level transportation, had been designed for efficiency and economy rather than resilience. The storm exposed how vulnerable this design philosophy left cities to extreme weather. Subsequent infrastructure development, including the decision to bury New York's future subways underground, reflected lessons learned from the March 1888 disaster. The economic impact of shutting down the nation's financial capital for several days exceeded any reasonable estimate. The New York Stock Exchange closed, banks couldn't process transactions, businesses couldn't conduct business. A single storm cost the economy millions of dollars in a week, a figure that modern equivalents would calculate in billions. The vulnerability of concentrating so much economic activity in locations subject to weather disruption became suddenly, painfully apparent. The stranded elevated trains became a particular symbol of the storm's power over technology. Hundreds of passengers spent the night in cars suspended above streets that had become impassable, unable to descend because the platforms were buried, unable to proceed because the tracks were blocked. Some passengers eventually climbed down via ropes or ladders, others waited until rescue crews could reach them. The experience of spending 18 hours in an elevated car without heat, food, or sanitation became a shared story that bound strangers into temporary community. Rural areas in the northeast suffered as well, though their stories received less attention than urban drama. Farmers found themselves in conditions quite similar to what their frontier counterparts had been enduring for decades, isolated, exposed, dependent on resources they'd stored before the storm. The surprise for eastern farmers was greater, their experience with severe winter weather more limited, but the survival challenges were fundamentally similar. The comparison between the Schoolchildren's blizzard and the Great Blizzard proved instructive for contemporary observers. The same meteorological forces that had killed prairie children killed eastern urbanites, demonstrating that geography provided no immunity to weather's power. Americans who had read about frontier blizzards with comfortable distance suddenly understood those stories differently, their own experience providing interpretive framework that abstractions couldn't supply. Fire departments faced impossible conditions, the same streets that citizens couldn't traverse, firefighters couldn't reach, and the same hydrants that normally supplied water stood frozen and inaccessible. Several fires that started during the storm spread unchecked, because response proved impossible. The layers of disaster, storm damage, fire damage, infrastructure damage, compounded in ways that extended recovery timelines well beyond what the storm itself had required. Emergency response, such as it existed, proved wholly inadequate. No institution was designed to handle a disaster of this scale and type. Government agencies, charitable organizations, and improvised citizen committees all contributed to relief efforts, but coordination was haphazard and resources were insufficient. The Great Blizzard demonstrated the need for systematic emergency preparedness that didn't yet exist, a lesson that would take additional disasters to fully implement. The storm ended, as storms do, and the monumental work of digging out began. But the memory persisted, shaping attitudes about urban infrastructure, emergency planning, and the relationship between civilization and nature that Americans had perhaps too casually assumed they understood. The telegraph office stands silent, its wires down, its operators helpless against the storm that has severed every connection to the outside world. This technology that promised to shrink distances, to make communication instantaneous, to bind the nation together in ways previous generations couldn't imagine, it has failed completely. The storm doesn't care about your wires. The vulnerability of 19th century technology to severe weather was absolute, in ways that modern systems, with their redundancies and backups, rarely experience. A single storm could, and regularly did, cut off communication across entire regions. Wires that required poles exposed to wind and ice accumulated damage that took weeks to repair. The intervals between storms sometimes proved insufficient for restoration, meaning some areas spent entire winters disconnected from national networks. You relied on the telegraph for news, for business, for maintaining connections to distant family members. Its failure during crises created information vacuums that speculation and rumour eagerly filled. When the wires went down, you didn't know what was happening in the next town, much less in distant cities. Reports that should have travelled in minutes instead travelled by messenger, assuming messengers could travel at all. The speed of information slowed from instantaneous to horse speed, sometimes to foot speed, sometimes to nothing at all. The railroad's failure represented an even more fundamental collapse. Trains carried not just passengers but freight, food, fuel, mail, the essentials of modern commerce. When trains stopped running, the entire supply chain stopped with them. Communities that had become dependent on regular railroad service discovered their dependence only when it became impossible to satisfy. The miracle of rail transportation proved to be a miracle that weather could suspend at will. One quirky technological response to storm disruptions involved the use of carrier pigeons, maintained by some newspapers specifically for situations when telegraph service failed. The birds could travel routes that storms had closed to other communication methods, though their reliability and speed fell far short of electronic alternatives. Pigeons carrying news seemed archaic even in the 1880s, a regression to pre-telegraph methods that underscored how completely modern systems had failed. Historians still argue about whether 19th century technology adoption outpaced the infrastructure needed to make it reliable. The telegraph network grew faster than the poles and wires could be engineered for resilience. The railroad system expanded faster than winter-hardened equipment could be developed. In the rush to enjoy technological benefits, perhaps insufficient attention went to ensuring those benefits would remain available when weather turned hostile. The heating systems of the era proved equally vulnerable. Stoves required fuel that couldn't always be delivered. Coal supplies that seemed adequate before storms hit proved inadequate when storms lasted longer than expected. Buildings designed around assumptions of steady fuel delivery became dangerously cold when delivery ceased. The technology of staying warm depended on supply chains that storms reliably disrupted. Water systems in cities froze, adding to infrastructure failures. Pipes burst, flooding basements with water that then froze into additional problems. Fire hydrants became useless when the water inside them solidified. The urban water infrastructure that represented genuine public health achievement couldn't survive extended freezing conditions any better than rural wells. The failure of street lighting, gas in most cities, added darkness to cold as compounding hardships. Lamplighters couldn't reach their posts through impassable streets. Gas pressure dropped as consumption spiked and supply chains failed. Cities that had grown accustomed to illuminated nights returned to pre-modern darkness that made navigation even more difficult than snow alone would have caused. Medical technology, limited even in the best circumstances, became virtually unavailable during severe storms. Doctors couldn't reach patients, and patients couldn't reach hospitals. The drugs and treatments that might have helped frozen or injured victims remained inaccessible. People died of conditions that contemporary medicine could have addressed, had geography not made that medicine unreachable. The post-storm assessment of technological failure prompted calls for reform that took various forms. Some advocated for burying wires underground, protecting them from weather that above-ground lines couldn't withstand. Others pushed for better snowplows and more robust railroad equipment. Still others argued for larger stockpiles, longer planning horizons, less dependence on just-in-time delivery of essentials. The debates continued for years, progress coming slowly through the intersection of technical innovation and economic investment. The fundamental lesson of technology's winter failures involved the relationship between system design and environmental reality. Systems designed for normal conditions failed in abnormal conditions. Systems optimized for efficiency lacked resilience against stress. Systems that seemed miraculous during favorable weather revealed themselves as fragile when weather turned hostile. These lessons would need to be relearned with each new technology, each new assumption about what weather would and wouldn't do. You dig out your doorway, assess the damage to your property, check on neighbours who might need help, and wait for the systems to restart. The telegraph will hum again eventually. The trains will run again eventually. The supply chains will resume eventually. But eventually provides cold comfort when you need help now, and the storms have demonstrated how much of modern life depends on conditions that can't be guaranteed. The technology that was supposed to conquer the frontier couldn't conquer winter, and that failure said something about the nature of both technology and winter that thoughtful observers found worth considering. The ledger book tells the story in numbers that don't lie, assets accumulated over years, eliminated in weeks, cattle that represented your life savings, frozen, crops that should have provided income, destroyed. Investments in equipment, buildings, improvements, all reduced to damaged goods requiring more investment you can't afford. The arithmetic of disaster leaves no room for sentiment. You owed this much, you lost this much, and the difference determines whether you have any future here. The economic devastation of severe winters extended far beyond individual tragedies, though it was certainly built from them. Aggregate livestock losses during the hard winter ran into the millions of dollars, not adjusted for inflation, actual 1880s dollars. Ranchers who had been wealthy in October were bankrupt by March, their herds reduced to frozen carcasses worth nothing except the labour required to dispose of them. The cattle industry of the Northern Plains essentially collapsed, and required years to rebuild. Banking systems that had financed frontier expansion found their loan portfolios suddenly worthless. The farmer who couldn't pay his mortgage because his cattle were dead created bad debt that banks couldn't absorb in quantity. Bank failures followed agricultural failures, creating cascading effects through regional economies. People who had deposited savings found those savings vanished along with the institutions that were supposed to protect them. The labour economics shifted dramatically during and after severe winters. Workers who might have commanded wages during normal times found no one hiring when businesses couldn't operate. Conversely, when recovery began, labour shortages drove wages up as too few workers were available for too much work. The boom-bust cycle that characterised frontier economics gained additional volatility from weather-induced disruptions that no market mechanism could smooth. One quirky economic detail: the price of coal and wood rose dramatically during winters that increased demand while reducing supply. Fuel merchants who had stockpiled before storms found themselves with windfall profits that their neighbours viewed as profiteering from shared misery. The ethical questions about pricing during emergencies, questions still debated today, arose repeatedly as fuel sellers charged what the market would bear during crises that revealed the market's harsh indifference to suffering. Historians still argue about the long-term economic impact of frontier winter disasters. Some suggest the losses represented just temporary setbacks that resilient economies quickly overcame. Others argue that the disaster losses fundamentally slowed development, permanently reducing the region's economic potential. The truth probably lies somewhere between, different for different places and different people, but nowhere deniable. Insurance products that might have spread risk barely existed in 19th century frontier agriculture. You bore your losses alone, with no corporate entity absorbing part of the blow. When the cattle died, you lost everything they represented. When the crops failed, you lost everything they would have produced. This total personal exposure to risk made frontier farming essentially a gamble, with weather as the house that always eventually won. Supply chain disruptions caused price spikes throughout affected regions. When trains couldn't run, goods couldn't flow, and scarcity drove prices beyond what many could afford. The flour that cost $1 before the storm might cost $5 during it, assuming flour was available at all. These price increases fell hardest on those least able to absorb them: the poor, the already struggling, the people whose margins were thinnest. The post-storm recovery economy created opportunities alongside hardships. Construction workers found plentiful employment, rebuilding damaged structures. Equipment suppliers sold replacement goods to farmers restocking. The destruction that impoverished some people enriched others, wealth redistributing according to who had skills or goods that the recovery demanded. This cruel dynamic, prosperity built on others' disaster, recurred after every major winter event. Credit became simultaneously more needed and less available. Farmers who had lost everything needed loans to start over, but banks that had absorbed losses weren't eager to take more risks. Interest rates rose. Collateral requirements tightened. Many who might have recovered with adequate financing couldn't access that financing and failed instead. The credit crunch that followed severe winters represented a second disaster, an economic storm that followed the meteorological one. Migration patterns shifted in response to repeated economic disasters. Farmers who had settled marginal lands abandoned them after proving that those lands couldn't sustain agriculture through severe winters. Population moved toward more reliable regions, leaving behind ghost homesteads that stood as monuments to failed ambitions. The frontier contracted even as it theoretically expanded, practical boundaries moving east even as legal boundaries moved west. government response to frontier economic disaster remained minimal by modern standards. No disaster relief programs existed, no crop insurance backstopped losses, no federal emergency management agency coordinated assistance. Communities relied on private charity, mutual aid, and individual resilience, resources that severe winters often exceeded. Calls for government intervention grew louder after each disaster, laying groundwork for the agricultural safety net that would eventually develop. The dreams of quick frontier wealth died in the snow alongside the cattle and crops they depended on. Promotional literature promising easy prosperity looked increasingly like fraud in retrospect. The actual experience of frontier farming involved risks that no pamphlet had mentioned, costs that no land speculator had calculated, and winters that no optimistic forecast had predicted. The economic aftermath of those winters included a more realistic assessment of frontier opportunity that tempered future enthusiasm with hard-won wisdom. The dead of multiple winters finally forced changes that the living couldn't achieve. Building codes emerged from accumulated disasters, specifying insulation requirements, structural standards, heating capacity, regulations that previous generations would have considered governmental overreach, but that post-disaster generations recognize as necessary protection. The freedom to build inadequate housing is no longer quite so absolute. Weather forecasting develops from desperate necessity into genuine science. The Storm King, as some called the blizzard pattern that killed so many, demanded prediction that could save lives. The United States Weather Bureau expands its operations, establishes reporting stations across the frontier, develops telegraph-based warning systems that can spread alerts faster than storms can travel. The technology is crude by later standards, but it represents the beginning of forecasting capability that will eventually become reliable. The Minnesota experience proves particularly instructive. After the hard winter and subsequent disasters, the state implements changes that other regions eventually adopt. Better construction techniques spread through agricultural extension services that don't exist yet but will soon. School districts develop protocols about weather-related closings that, had they existed earlier, might have prevented the schoolchildren's blizzard from becoming quite so deadly. Settlement patterns shift in recognition of winter realities. The lands that seemed promising during wet cycles reveal themselves as marginal during dry cycles and deadly during severe winters. Farmers move, voluntarily or through bankruptcy, toward regions where the odds seem better. The Dakota population that boomed during the 1870s and early 80s contracts as some of those settlers conclude that persistence constitutes obstinacy rather than virtue. One quirky innovation that emerged from winter disasters involves the blizzard rope, that simple lifeline strung between buildings that could save a life when visibility dropped to zero. The practice becomes standard on farms throughout the northern plains, so fundamental that children learn it alongside other essential survival skills. Ropes didn't prevent blizzards, but they prevented some blizzard deaths, which counted for something. Historians still argue about which changes made the most difference in subsequent survival rates. Was it better buildings, better forecasting, better supplies? The changes came as a package, making attribution difficult. What seems clear is that later winters of similar severity produced fewer casualties than earlier ones, suggesting that something, probably many things, had improved. The livestock industry adapts through breed selection, feeding practices and shelter improvements. Cattle that survived harsh winters became breeding stock for offspring expected to face similar conditions. Hay storage increases, providing reserves that make it through extended isolation. Barns get better, windbreaks more systematic, the entire approach to keeping animals alive through winter more sophisticated. The losses that devastated the 1880s ranching industry become less common as knowledge accumulates. Transportation resilience improves through engineering advances that take decades to fully implement. Snowplows get more powerful, rails get buried in cuts that reduce drift accumulation. Train cars get better heating systems. The railroad that failed so dramatically during the hard winter becomes gradually more reliable, though never fully immune to winter's intervention. The relationship between transportation and weather shifts from surrender to negotiation. Educational responses to the schoolchildren's blizzard include both practical and pedagogical elements. Teachers receive guidance about weather decisions that their predecessors lacked. School buildings improve to provide better shelter for students trapped by sudden storms. The community as a whole accepts responsibility for school safety in ways that individual teachers and parents previously bore alone. The political landscape shifts as disasters demonstrate the limits of purely individual responses to collective problems. Calls for government assistance, anathema to frontier individualism in previous decades, gain acceptance as communities recognise that some problems exceed private capacity. The groundwork for agricultural programs, disaster relief and social safety nets is laid by winters that prove private resources inadequate. Memory itself becomes a form of prevention. Stories of disasters pass through families and communities, creating awareness that shapes behaviour decades after the original events. You know about the hard winter because your parents told you, and you'll tell your children, creating continuous cultural knowledge that informs preparation across generations. The dead contribute to the living by teaching lessons that words alone couldn't convey. The transformation is incomplete. Winters still kill, livestock still freeze, blizzards still isolate, but it's real. The frontier of 1890 differs from the frontier of 1880 in ways that reflect hard lessons learned through hard experience. The changes came too late for those who died teaching them, but not too late for those who learned. The blood price of winter wisdom was paid in full, and the survivors drew what meaning they could from their costly education. They couldn't prevent all future suffering. No one can prevent all suffering, but they could, and did, reduce the suffering that preventable ignorance had previously produced. The snow begins its long retreat in late March, pulling back like a tide that overstayed its welcome. You step outside one morning and notice something different. Not warmth exactly, but the absence of that bitter edge that has defined every breath for months. The sun seems to have actual warmth now, its rays penetrating rather than just illuminating. The grip is loosening. Spring is finally, impossibly, actually coming. The melt reveals what winter has hidden. The locations of snow-buried buildings, the paths of fences long invisible, the contours of a landscape that you'd almost forgotten existed beneath the white. It also reveals darker things. Bodies appear as drifts recede, livestock corpses scattered across miles, the occasional human form preserved by cold, evidence of the season's toll that accumulated invisibly and now demands acknowledgement. You walk your property slowly, cataloguing losses that winter prevented you from tallying. The barn needs repair where snow weight stressed the roof. Fences lie flattened where drifts collapsed them. The garden plot you'd carefully prepared last fall shows damage from frost heave that will require additional work before planting. Everything requires work. Everything has been touched by the cold months, marked by them, diminished by them. The livestock count proceeds with grim deliberation. You started the winter with this many cattle, horses, pigs, chickens. You ended it with fewer of each, the mathematics of loss expressed in empty stalls and silent coops. The surviving animals look thin, weakened by months of inadequate feed and bitter cold. They need extra care now, careful rebuilding of reserves depleted by survival. Some won't make it even now, their systems too compromised for recovery. One quirky spring phenomenon involves the particular smell of the thaw. Months of accumulated organic matter, livestock waste, decomposing vegetation, everything that winter froze in place, suddenly releases its odours as temperatures rise. The smell is powerful and not particularly pleasant, but it represents the return of biological processes that indicate genuine spring. You learn to welcome even unpleasant smells after months when everything was frozen, odourless, suspended. The community emerges from isolation, blinking and tentative. Neighbours you haven't seen since November appear at your doorstep, their faces showing the effects of shared hardship. Stories are exchanged, who made it, who didn't, whose supplies held out, whose ran short, the close calls and the tragedies and the unexpected survivals. The social fabric that winter frayed begins reweaving itself, threads reconnecting as travel becomes possible again. The first supply wagons arrive like ships reaching castaways. Goods you've done without for months suddenly become available. Flour, sugar, coffee, fabric, tools, all the commerce that winter suspended. The prices reflect scarcity and transportation difficulty, but you pay them anyway, grateful for access to things you'd almost forgotten you missed. Normal life resumes one transaction at a time. The graves you couldn't dig properly in frozen ground need attention. Temporary burials get corrected, markers that frost heaved get reset. Respects that harsh conditions prevented get finally, properly paid. The cemetery receives its full share of winter's harvest, each mound representing someone's loss, someone's grief, someone's memory that will continue after the body has finished its work. Planting season arrives before you're fully ready, it always does, demanding that you shift from recovery mode to production mode faster than exhaustion allows. The fields need preparation, the seeds need sowing, the cycle needs continuing regardless of how tired you feel. You plant with faith that seems remarkable after what you've just survived, trusting that this year's work will produce this year's harvest, that the future will reward present labour. The children, those who survived, grow taller as spring advances, their bodies catching up on growth that winter had suspended. You watch them playing in sunshine that feels miraculous after months of darkness and cold. Their laughter sounds different now. You hear it differently, understanding as you didn't before how easily that laughter might have been silenced, how precious its continuation really is. Memories of the winter past will fade somewhat as distance accumulates, but they'll never disappear entirely. Something has been written into your understanding of the world that wasn't there before. Knowledge of limits, awareness of fragility, recognition that survival is never guaranteed. This knowledge shapes your preparations for next winter, your appreciation of current warmth, your gratitude for a spring you weren't certain you'd see. The wind still blows across the prairie, but it carries warmth now instead of death. The grass greens in patches where snow has fully melted, small signals of the transformation underway. Birds return, their songs filling silence that seemed permanent during the frozen months. The world comes back to life, and you with it, both of you scarred by winter, but not defeated by it. You survived. Your family survived. Somehow through luck and planning and desperate improvisation and grace you don't fully understand, you made it through to this morning and this sunshine and this beginning. The work continues, the endless, demanding, life-sustaining work that frontier existence requires, but now it continues in warmth, with hope toward harvests that will replenish what winter depleted. And now your breath begins to slow, your thoughts to gentle, the long journey through those harsh winters settling into quiet reflection. The fire has burned down to embers, casting soft orange light across walls that keep you safe and warm. Outside your window the world rests peaceful, undisturbed, the storms of history long past and powerless to touch you here in this moment of stillness. The settlers whose struggles you've shared have found their rest as well, some in prairie graveyards long since grown over with grass, others in family plots that descendants still tend, all of them released now from the cold that once threatened everything they loved. Their courage flows forward through generations, through you, through the simple act of remembering what they endured and what they taught. Let your shoulders soften now, let your jaw unclench. Let the tension you've been carrying dissolve like spring snow, returning to the earth that will use it to grow new life. The hardship was real, but so was the survival, and tonight you rest in the warmth they fought so hard to pass along to those who came after. The wind outside whispers stories too old to translate, but their meaning comes through clearly enough. Rest now, sleep well, you are safe, and morning will bring its own gentle light. The winters end, they always end, and what remains is the warmth of a life lived fully, of struggles overcome, of love that no cold can ever quite extinguish. Sweet dreams.